It all started on a morning in early September. I was awakened by the sound of a truck outside my window. I got out of bed to take a look, and through the blinds I saw that a new neighbor was moving into the house across the street. This house had been without an owner for almost 6 months, and the previous neighbors had been wonderful people who often invited us to parties and were involved in the life of our small neighborhood. Many neighbors were very upset when they moved out, and now, after 6 months, I saw a new neighbor. At first glance, he seemed like an ordinary person. He was a tall, muscular man, clearly someone who goes to the gym. He appeared to be over 40 years old. I didn't rush to introduce myself, thinking that I would have time to get to know him better later on. I didn't immediately notice the strange things happening around me. I had a lot of work piled up at the time, and I was very busy. But in late September, I saw an incomprehensible sight. I had been working late into the night when I decided to step out onto my porch to get some fresh air before going to bed. At that moment, I noticed that the light was flickering in one of the windows of the house across from mine. The flashes were brief, but every time the light flickered, I saw a shadow behind the window, a tall figure. It was my recently moved-in neighbor, but because of the flashing light, I couldn't fully make out his features. However, there was something creepy about his posture. His arms were hanging down and his body was motionless, as if he were a statue. But at the same time, the neighbor was rapidly jerking his head from side to side in a strange manner. At some point, he suddenly stopped and looked out the window. Even though it was very dark, and the distance between us was quite far, I could see his eyes. They seemed to be glowing in the darkness. Oh my God, he wasn't looking at the street or my house. He was looking at me. But why? What does he want? I confess, I was scared. I'm not a coward, but it was very creepy. So I went back home, turned off the lights, and decided to look at the neighbor's house again. The light show had stopped, and there was no one behind the window. I exhaled and decided that I shouldn't jump to conclusions and should first get to know my neighbor and ask him what happened this night. The next day, I went to my neighbor's house. I was, of course, a little scared, but I managed to calm myself down. The neighbor turned out to be a very friendly person. He invited me in, served me tea, and told me a little about himself. It turned out that he was an engineer and worked for a large private company. I didn't notice anything strange about him, except that up close he seemed even taller and more muscular, and I should say he was very talkative. After a while, we were already talking about many different topics. Later on, I finally dared to ask him what happened last night. At first, the neighbor was surprised by my question, but then calmly replied that he often trains at night. I left the new neighbor's house and was a little happy that I got to know him. And of course, I believed what he said. I thought to myself, people can be different, and just because he trains at night doesn't mean he's some kind of weirdo. Is it worth worrying about it? However, at that time I did not understand how much I was really mistaken. On the same night, I had a nightmare about my new neighbor. In the dream, he was not alone, but with a large gray, ash-colored dog. They were chasing me, and I was trying to run away, but then I fell into a pit with no bottom. I woke up sweating, and for the first few seconds, I didn't understand where I was. I found it hard to breathe. When I regained my senses, I decided to drink some water. I thought it was all due to stress and lack of sleep, but the feeling of unease did not go away. In the kitchen, I unconsciously looked out the window of the neighbor's house and saw the flashing light again. However, there was no neighbor outside the window. Then I strained my eyes and saw him. He was on the street near his porch, in the darkness, like a big and scary shadow. He stood motionless, only his head jerked randomly, and then he abruptly stopped and looked at me again. Even in the dim light in the kitchen, I understood that he could see me very well. I couldn't take my eyes off him and didn't understand what was happening. And suddenly, my phone rang loudly, and I dropped the glass of water in fright. I answered the call, but there was only silence on the other end. I started asking loudly, "Who is calling me at night?" And at that moment, I heard someone growling. It was the dogs growling, like from my dream. I was scared and turned off the phone and quickly looked out the window, but there was no one on the street anymore. After a sleepless night, I came to the conclusion that I needed to observe my neighbor before taking any action. Maybe everything that was happening to me was just my imagination. Despite my fatigue, I still went to work. Strange feeling followed me in the office, that someone was watching me. Wherever I went, it seemed to me that my neighbor was standing around the corner and looking at me. When I thought about it, shivers ran down my spine. I couldn't calm down and get rid of this feeling. When I got home that evening, I first locked the door and placed a baseball bat next to my bed for safety. I gradually turned into a paranoid person, but my safety was what worried me most. Towards dusk, I peeked out the window and was very shocked. At that moment, I even forgot how to breathe, and my whole back was covered in cold sweat. I saw my new neighbor calmly walking down the path, but he wasn't alone. There was a dog on a leash next to him, the same gray dog from my dream. In reality, it was even bigger and scarier. The neighbor seemed to feel that I was watching him, turned towards me and waved as if nothing had happened. He was smiling, but the dog was staring at me intently, as if it were not an animal, but a sentient human. I was scared and hid. What else could I do in this situation? At night, I couldn't fall asleep at all. I kept thinking about calling the police. But what would I tell them? "Listen, there's a creepy neighbor living next to me with a scary dog. They haven't done anything to me, but they're scaring me to death. Help me." Will the police listen to me? Will they believe me? With these thoughts, I didn't realize that I had fallen asleep, and I had another nightmare. I was in a very dark tunnel and my neighbor was chasing me again with his dog. I was running towards the exit, but every time I got closer, the tunnel would get longer and the exit would get farther away. I feel like they're catching up to me. I scream for help, but no one hears me. I can't even hear myself because I lost my voice. And just when they almost caught me, I realized it was a dream and literally forced myself to wake up. When I opened my eyes, I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear at what I saw in front of me. He was there, my neighbor, standing next to me with his dog, smiling. I quickly turned on the light and grabbed a bat, but there was no one in the room anymore, as if he had vanished. I ran downstairs to call the police. At that moment, I didn't care whether it was all in my head or if the neighbor had actually entered my home. I want only one thing: for all of this to stop. One cannot invade private property. But when I approach the phone, it suddenly starts ringing, and I cautiously pick up the phone and answer the call. On the other end, I hear a voice, his voice, almost whispering to me, "Don't turn around, we're nearby." Frantically, I begin to think, what should I do? How to act? Where to run? At that moment, I hear a sound behind me. I turn around sharply and swing the bat, but there is no one there. I don't see anyone, but I feel with my whole body that the neighbor is very close, next to me. I can even hear his breathing. Then I decide to run to the only, as I think, safe place in the house, the basement. I rush and run out of the living room. Passing by the kitchen, suddenly, I see a big gray dog. It is like a statue silently watching me as I run into the basement. Out of fear, I throw the bat in its direction, and without looking back, I dive down the stairs. At the moment when, as it seemed to me, someone touched my back, I slammed the door to the basement shut behind me. My lungs are burning. It's hard for me to breathe. I'm all wet with sweat. I'm scared. My legs are shaking. But despite all this, I continue to hold the door tightly. But to my surprise, no one is trying to break into the basement. I don't even hear the sound of footsteps. I can't hear anything at all. There is not a single sound, as if the whole world is frozen. And at that moment, when I had already decided that the neighbor had left, I heard his whisper, as if he was speaking in my head. "It will come soon." In shock, I sat in the basement until morning. Only after a few hours, I was able to come to my senses after everything that had happened to me. Leaving the house, I first went to the nearest police station, and an hour later, the police were searching the neighbor's house. With all the noise I had caused, other neighbors gathered. They did not understand why there was police in their area. I began to explain that I had to call them because of a terrible person who had settled next to us, to which the neighbors said in surprise that no one had moved into that house. It had not been sold yet. It was still on the market. This happened last year. I then got a job as a security guard at a private laboratory. I worked alone on the night shift. They paid well and I was satisfied. The laboratory was equipped with cameras and an alarm system, and for the first 2 days, I sat in the security booth for hours, just watching the corridors through the monitor screen. Sometimes out of boredom, I would patrol the area, but I rarely entered the laboratory itself. On the 5th day of my work, strange things started happening in the laboratory. During a patrol of the area, I came across a flock of burned birds, and on the 6th day of my duty, I saw rats running out of the building, as if they were scared of something. I told the director about everything. He said that I should not worry. 2 days later, I learned that another night shift security guard had quit, and I was asked to temporarily replace him. There were no reasons to refuse, and that evening, I went to work. I was greeted by a familiar cleaner. She handed me the keys and looked at me strangely. After midnight, as usual, I went on a tour of the territory. On this day, there was a full moon, and the night was brighter than usual. When I approached the laboratory, I felt a strong smell of smoke. This worried me. The first thing I thought was that there was a fire in the building, however. It turned out to be a false alarm. Everything in the laboratory was in order. But the smell of smoke continued to haunt me, even when I returned to the security booth. The worst thing was that over time, the unpleasant smell became stronger. The smell stopped chasing me only after I left the clinic's territory. In the evening, I returned to duty again and again met the cleaner. She silently handed me the keys, but continued to look at me strangely. And to my surprise, she suddenly asked why I had not quit yet. I replied honestly that I was satisfied with everything. During a night patrol, I discovered that one of the exterior doors of the laboratory was open. As I was about to close it, I heard strange noises from a distant office, as if someone was groaning. I became curious and entered the building. Everywhere there was a smell of smoke, and I also noticed strange footprints on the floor, prints of dirty black feet. I decided that this was an invasion, but why did the alarm not go off? Suddenly, through the glass door, I saw a large black shadow. It was moving quickly. I decided that this was a robber, so I took out my rubber club and began to speak loudly so that he did not do anything stupid and that the police were already on the way. The robber stopped and, through the glass, began to watch me. At that moment, the groans stopped. I noticed that for the robber, his shadow was quite large, more than 2 meters. Also, he was completely black. I couldn't see him well due to the lighting, but it seemed to me that black smoke was coming from him. I was very scared and began to retreat back to the exit. I realized that this was not a robber, and certainly not a human. At that moment, the smell of smoke intensified, and the shadow began to slowly move towards the door. Without waiting for it to grab me, I started running as fast as I could. Even when I left the building and got into my car, even when I left the laboratory's territory, I continued to smell smoke. The next day I quit my job, but before I left, I met with the cleaner. We talked for a while until she mentioned why security guards don't stay here for more than 2 weeks. She stopped mid-sentence, saying that she shouldn't talk about it. But in the end, after my persuasion, She told the truth. According to her, there were cases when security guards went crazy. Some of them disappeared without a trace, and in the past month, 2 security guards were found dead. She said that she had spoken with some of them, and that all of them repeated the same thing. They were being pursued by the smell of smoke, and they saw a large shadow. I was shocked. According to her, I was lucky because this creature always stays in the shadows and attaches itself to those it frequently sees. In the end, security guards are the only ones who roam the laboratory's territory alone. They didn't let us negotiate. When the director heard our conversation, he strictly asked me to leave immediately and not come back. I did just that. But even now, a year later, sometimes the smell of smoke comes back to me, and I feel like someone is watching and waiting for me in the shadows. My dear Mary, I hope you and our little princess are doing well. I know it's been a few weeks since my last letter, but the situation here is really difficult. The Battle of Ypres is ongoing, and we are still in the trenches, about 1.5 meters below ground. It's easy to stumble and fall into the dirty water that's up to our waists. This is a real war, my love, and every day I'm trying to survive. Every day we exchange fire, and every day we lose our brothers. Shells are flying constantly. I was struck by how quickly one can get used to the sounds of explosions and gunfire. From time to time, I ponder the senselessness of this war. We're killing people we've never seen, who haven't personally harmed us. And all this is to defend our borders or territories. But what's the point if we still keep fighting and dying? I think about you and our little one every minute, Mary. I miss your smile and kisses, but I know we have to go through this to be together. Despite everything, I'm ready to fight until the end to protect our family and country. Until we meet again, my love. I promise to come back to you as soon as possible. With love, your husband. I put down the letter and looked at the sky. In that moment, I prayed silently. It was raining. I don't remember for how many days. Every day I saw the same scene. Gray and overcast sky, water and mud, the smells of blood, metal and gunpowder, the stench of decay. I got used to it. You get used to everything. At first, the sight of wounded soldiers made me nauseous. Then I looked at everything with disgust. And now I calmly smoke next to the body of my friend Thomas. We went through several battles together, and despite everything that happened to us, Thomas was an optimist and believed that humanity was headed towards a great future. I have to say, he was cheerful and often joked. Perhaps everything Thomas said was just a joke. I loved him, and of course it was painful and very sad for me. But it's hard to explain this pain. It's not the same as before. This damned war changed me. It opened the gates of hell, and now the demons dance on our bones. Now, only my memories of my wife and child save me from complete madness. And these letters, they are like a lifeline, reminding me that there is a reason to live, and that this war will eventually end. While waiting for the next attack, I wrapped the letter and put it in the pocket of my pants. Suddenly, another shell came from the enemy side and exploded near the trench. I was thrown back and fell on my back. When I tried to get up, I felt a sharp pain, and at that moment, I saw the dark brown smoke and smelled the pungent scent of mustard. Strangely, probably due to hunger. Without delay, I decided to crawl away and regroup, but due to the loss of blood and fatigue, I began to lose consciousness. I had a dream, a field strewn with flowers. In the distance, I see Mary holding my daughter in her arms. She smiles at me, and I see my house. I have returned. Suddenly someone calls me. I turn around and see my friend Thomas. He is pale with lifeless glassy eyes, and his clothes are all covered in dirt, and I see signs of decay on his body. He asks me, "Do you know what your sin is?" At that moment, I woke up. It was already late at night, and everything around was very quiet. Apparently, the enemy attack had subsided. I tried to stand up. It was hard, as if the very ground did not want to let me go. But I managed to get up on my feet. Looking around, I saw corpses. There were so many of them. Friends, enemies. They all lay in various ugly poses. And in this mess of human bodies, it was difficult to understand who was who. It was a gruesome sight that would haunt me for the rest of my days. And then something clicked in my head, and I realized that I needed to run as long as I had the strength. To my wife, to my child, to my home, and let them declare me a deserter. Let them shoot me. Whatever happens, I have to see my family. Otherwise, I'll go insane and never come back from this hell. I took my gun and headed out. This night would become my ally. It would shield me from unwanted eyes. The front line may seem endless, but it has boundaries, and I know exactly where I need to go. Quietly, I passed through the trenches, emerged outside, and began to crawl slowly through the mud and the bodies of the dead. In military training, we were taught first and foremost how to crawl, run, and shoot. It seemed grueling at the time, but now I am grateful to the captain. However, lying on the ground, one feels the closeness of death most keenly. Those who have tasted the flavor of war know the smell of wet and burnt earth first and foremost. I crawled slowly, thinking about my unfortunate fate, when suddenly someone grabbed me. I looked down and saw someone's hands sticking out from under the ground, tightly gripping my tunic. I tried to push them away in confusion, but they were stronger than me, and I couldn't break free. Then I started digging and saw a face sticking out from under the ground. Thomas's face with his black, insane eyes. He was buried, but how? How did Thomas end up here, far from our positions? He smiled at me and asked, "Do you know what your sin is?" Shock and madness. I didn't know what to say in response. I was lost. At that moment, I saw a signal flare shoot up into the sky. It illuminated the entire field. I crouched down so as not to be noticed, and Thomas let me go. He disappeared, vanished into the ground, as if no one was there. I continued digging, but didn't find anyone. There was no point in waiting any longer, so I gathered my strength, got up, and ran towards the forest. We jokingly called this forest Enchanted. According to rumors, ancient warrior spirits lived here. But in reality, almost nothing was left of the forest. Only bare, burnt trees and swamps surrounded us. The war had devastated this place. People killed this forest, turning it into a grim wasteland. And now, deserters, and perhaps even the dead, hid in its shadows. I was not alone. I saw others fleeing the battlefield, but my attention was drawn to a formation of soldiers. It was difficult to call them alive. In tattered, bloody uniforms, missing body parts and flesh, they barely moved as they crossed the swamps. Their captain led this procession, a frighteningly disfigured creature, like a living dead. They paid no attention to anyone, many of them drowning in the swamp, but they didn't care. They just kept going until they disappeared into the darkness of the forest. I continued on my way. The day had quietly arrived. The gray sky today seemed even gloomier. I walked along the broken roads and met a soldier. He was severely wounded. His clothes were torn and soaked in blood. He was burnt and blood was coming out of his ears and eyes. He was blind. His hands were covered in hideous blisters and were trembling, but he continued digging the trench. I approached him closer and heard him muttering, "I didn't kill, but I wanted to. I killed, but I didn't want to." I tried to call out to him, to ask him why he was doing this, but the soldier didn't hear me. He continued saying, "I didn't kill, but I wanted to. I killed, but I didn't want to." Another lost lunatic. How many more destinies should this damned war cripple? I didn't feel sorry for him. Pity is not an affordable luxury in war. I understood that this soldier was lost, his mind clouded with fear, just like mine. I too was slowly going insane. I saw things that couldn't be real. Dead soldiers in the forest, my friend Thomas, ghosts of the people I killed haunting me. But I had a goal. My family. This gave me strength and I continued on, no matter what. The land was covered in fog, and it was difficult to see ahead through its dense cover. The fog distorted this world. I saw a group of soldiers trying to haul a broken tank and military equipment up a hill. They were shouting, and it was hard and painful for them. The mud hindered them, and every time they almost reached the top, the equipment rolled back down, crushing and maiming the soldiers. But despite this, they got up again and continued to haul the military equipment. This happened again and again and again. On the top of the hill, I noticed a huge three-headed dog. It sat majestically, watching people suffer below. At that moment, I wondered, what choices did they make in life to end up here? Did they have a choice? There was no reason to linger, so I continued on my way. At night, I reached another front where active fighting was taking place. Shots, screams, shells, explosions. Soldiers were attacking and dying, resurrecting and throwing themselves back into battle. I saw a general. He was a very tall and very fat man, sitting on a large leather chair that was drowning in black stench. He had two faces, one smiling and gnawing on a bloody bone, and the other hysterically giving orders. I saw my captain standing at attention and saluting the general. The captain was engulfed in flames, literally burning brightly. Watching this was unbearable. I saw the pain and fear in the eyes of the soldiers, miserable people suffering because they were following orders. I couldn't bear to watch anymore, so I ran away. I ran and ran through the rain and snow, through a hail of bullets. I ran as far as I could. I couldn't take the madness I had seen anymore. I thought I had stopped feeling fear, compassion, any emotions at all, but now I was crying. It hurt me. I was scared. I ran to the lake. It was very quiet and cold here. The water had frozen into thick ice. However, its surface was littered with human heads. They protruded from under the ice. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were trapped up to their necks and silently continued the battle. It was difficult to distinguish which head belonged to an enemy and which to an ally. But even now they tried to kill each other. I saw one head biting another. In this silence, the crunch and crack of bones, the sounds emitted by the dead sounded unnatural, like something otherworldly. I got very tired and lay down to rest and quickly fell asleep. I had the same dream again. A field covered with flowers. In the distance I see Mary. She is holding my daughter in her arms. She smiles at me. I see my home. I run to them, but the closer I get, the farther away they are. I shout to them, call them, but they don't hear me. My mind begins to leave me, and then I woke up. It was morning. The ice on the lake had melted. Now there was only dark water around. On the shore, I noticed a boatman, a strangely dressed old man with one eye. He wore a blue cloak and leather armor. He offered to ferry me to the other side. I agreed. As we were already sailing on the boat, I saw my friend again. Thomas was standing not far away. His body was decomposing. In some places, white bones were visible. He pointed at me with his hand and said something. I couldn't hear him, but I knew what he was talking about. We were sailing slowly, crossing the dark lake. I was looking at my distorted reflection in the water when the old man distracted me. He asked, "What are you afraid of? Why did you leave your weapon, warrior?" I was surprised by his question. The old man understood my thoughts and said that I was not the first he had ferried across this lake. After some thought, I replied to him, "I'm not afraid of death. I'm afraid of not having time to see my daughter's face." When the war started, my wife was still pregnant. The old man looked at me with his one eye. After a brief moment of reflection, he said to me, "Nonsense. Everyone is afraid of death." He didn't say anything else. On the shore, I thanked the old man and said goodbye to him. He waved his hand to me and sat back in his boat. At that moment, I thought that the old man might have been waiting for me, I mentally thanked the old man once again and walked along the country path to my native village. Closer to noon, I arrived at the old church. When I was a child, my mother often brought me here. Now the church was abandoned. There was a light drizzle, and fog hung over the village. I quickly walked along the main street and turned towards my house. And finally, I made it. I opened the gate, entered the courtyard, and stopped by the front door. At that moment, I felt true terror. My hands were shaking. My legs wouldn't listen to me. My thoughts were confused. I knew that I would see my family now, but what then? What next? What should I do? Overcoming my fear, I cautiously opened the door and quietly entered the house. In the living room, I saw Mary sitting at the table. I stopped to examine her and couldn't take my eyes off her. Oh God, she's beautiful. Suddenly I heard rustling from the adjacent room. I walked further and saw a small crib, and in it my princess was sleeping peacefully. She's still a little one, with very beautiful chubby arms and legs. She's an angel. I wish I could hug my daughter tightly right now. But why is Mary silent? Why isn't she smiling? Is she crying? I approached her and saw letters on the table. One of them was my last letter that I didn't have time to send to her. The second one was from the command stating that I heroically died in battle at Ypres. I said sadly, I knew, I had a suspicion. But do I have the right to be here? How much time do I have left? I heard a noise and turned around. In the doorway stood a skeleton, with torn uniform hanging from its bones. He was waiting for me. It was Thomas. There was no human flesh left on him, but I recognized him. Now he was part of another world. Now I understood everything. I realized everything. My friend asked me, "Do you know what your sin is?" I hesitated but still answered, "Yes, I know." "It's time for us to go," said Thomas. I looked at my little daughter one last time, kissed Mary, and we left. My advice to you is to always choose a safe route, even if you're just going to the nearest store or pharmacy. Unfortunately, I chose a dangerous route and almost died. It happened last month, and I still don't know what happened to me and how I managed to survive. It all started with an invitation. Coworker invited me to spend the weekend at his country house. It was far from the city, and the road leading to it was unfamiliar to me. Coworker assured me that anyone could easily get there without much effort. And in fact, the route seemed simple to me. Up the 75 highway, after a few miles, turn left at 2 hills, and straight ahead until the end. I left the city later in the evening, and unexpectedly found myself in a strong rain, hurricane, and thunderstorm, although the weather forecasters promised a clear, sunny day. It happens. Everyone makes mistakes. That's what I thought as I crossed those hills. The visibility of the road was terrible, so I drove slowly. Getting into an accident was not part of my plans. After 2 hours of slow driving, I saw a fallen tree on the road. Another obstacle. Well, I'll have to drive around. And how lucky it was that right in front of the tree was a turn onto another road. The lighting was missing and the road seemed very old to me. It was clear that cars rarely passed by on it. Part of the road was washed out by water, and it was difficult to drive on. I was seriously worried that I could get stuck in the mud. And then, in the distance, the roofs of houses appeared. It was already past midnight, and the rain was only getting worse. Continuing the road in such weather was impossible. So, I decided to call coworker and tell him that I would come in the morning and spend the night in this small town. To my surprise, I couldn't catch a signal on my phone. I had no choice but to decide to call from the motel, and I drove on. I noticed that this small town literally consisted of one road, various buildings and houses located along the road. Many of them were very old and seemed empty and uninhabitable. The entire town was incredibly quiet and gloomy. If it weren't for the light in the windows, I would have thought it was abandoned. In search of a motel, I stopped near one house to ask the residents. At that moment, a lightning bolt flashed and I saw a silhouette on the road. It was a tall, pale person with a very long neck and arms, dressed in rags. He jumped back and ran towards the house. All of this happened literally in a moment, and I was a little shocked, but I took control of myself. I decided that due to poor visibility and fatigue, I saw this person slightly distorted. I drove as close as possible to the house where, as it seemed to me, that person went. And hiding from the rain, I quickly ran under the porch. I knocked politely on the door several times and loudly called out to the owner, but there was no response. This was strange, as there was light on in the house. I also saw shadows in the windows and heard footsteps behind the door. It was pouring rain and I couldn't take it anymore, so I decided to enter the house without an invitation. I opened the door and went inside. The house was dimly lit and it smelled of dampness, mold, and wet earth. I called out to the owner again, but there was still no answer. I decided to go deeper into the house and walked around the living room, ending up in the kitchen. It was even darker here, with only one light on. The atmosphere was very dirty and unpleasant. I noticed a pile of dirty dishes and unfinished food on the table, and also noticed cockroaches and ants everywhere. A flash of lightning illuminated the backyard of the house, which was covered in grave markers. It was like a cemetery. That is to say, it was actually a cemetery. I felt a chill run down my spine. But what should I do next? I decided to go around the house and then return to my car. The floor creaked loudly under my feet, and I found myself in a small room, which, like the kitchen, was in terrible condition. The wallpaper was peeling off the walls, the ceiling was all in leaks, and there was a smeared dry dirt on the floor. I did not dare to go up to the second floor, and deciding that I had enough, began to leave the house. Passing by the door leading to the basement, I heard a noise and stopped. Suddenly, with a creak, the door opened by itself. I was scared, but I did not run away. After thinking for a moment, I decided to see who was making noise in the basement. As soon as I leaned over, something pushed me from behind and I flew down. It hurt, but I gathered my strength and began to look around. The basement smelled strongly of decay. It was almost impossible to breathe. Turning on the flashlight on my phone, I was horrified. I saw something that I will never forget, and my blood still runs cold. I saw bones. The whole basement was covered with human bones. But the most terrifying thing was that in the shadows I noticed that silhouette. A person with long arms. He had a pale, smooth head of unnatural shape, small black eyes, a large, strong jaw, and sharp teeth. This creature was gnawing something, making disgusting sounds. He suddenly stopped and looked at me, slowly rising. He was over 2 meters tall. I did not wait for this monster to attack me, quickly jumped and ran up the stairs. Behind me, I heard a heart-rending roar, and when I was already near the entrance door, it grabbed me by the leg. I turned around and hit it with a chair that I managed to grab. It let go, and I ran out onto the street. The rain had already stopped, and a mist was spreading over the ground. Sitting in the car, I instantly pulled the handbrake and drove off. Looking in the rearview mirror, I saw only an old cemetery. No houses, no buildings, just gravestones. And these monsters, tall creatures in rags, silently watched as I moved further and further away. In the morning, I finally reached my colleague's country house. He was shocked to see me. I was all dirty, tired, and with panicked eyes, I couldn't speak a word. Later, I came to my senses and told him what had happened to me. Co-worker then said that there is no small town behind the 2 hills, only an old cemetery that has been closed for a long time. But according to an old legend, there used to be a small town there that burned down along with all its inhabitants several centuries ago. Of course, after such a story, I returned by another highway and never accepted any invitations from co-worker again. This happened in the summer. I live with my parents in Chicago, but when I was little, I often went to my grandmother's house on holidays. She lived in a small town in Nebraska. I spent a lot of time there. I loved my grandmother very much, and she always spoiled me. In my free time, I often took my bike and rode around the town. I became friends with my neighbors and played with the local boys. One day I stopped near one house to rest and drink some water. It was very hot and stuffy, so I sat down on the sidewalk in the shade of a big tree, which also shaded the house. The house was very old, with dirty, murky windows, some of which were boarded up, and the lawn was overgrown with wild bushes. I decided that no one had lived in this house for a long time. It was approaching lunchtime, and I was about to get on my bike when an old woman approached me. She came, as I understood, from this house. I didn't hear the sound of the door or her footsteps, which surprised me, but I didn't attach any significance to it. The old lady started talking to me, asking what I was playing, what my name was, and where I lived. She seemed kind and was trying to smile all the time, but something in her gaze made me uneasy. I remember her face for the rest of my life, very thin and wrinkled, dark blue bags under her eyes, sharp nose with a bump, strong cheekbones and an unusually large mouth, although her lips were thin. We talked a little bit, and when I was already getting ready to leave, she asked me to help her move some old boxes from the garage. She said they were heavy, and she couldn't lift them herself, so I agreed. The garage seemed very dark to me, with dust and dirt everywhere, and a lot of clutter. She pointed to the boxes and asked me to bring them into the kitchen, and as I was about to take the boxes, I heard a scream from the far end of the house. I was startled and looked at the old woman. She tried to explain that it was her sick son and that I should not pay attention to it. I decided it was best for me to leave and began to leave. The old woman chased after me and begged me to stay. When she realized that I was not going to listen to her, she began to shout at me in anger. I grabbed my bicycle and rode away from her. At that moment, I became even more scared. Her eyes turned black, her lips turned green, and her hair seemed to come alive. She pointed at me with her hand and began speaking quickly in a language I did not understand. I rushed home as fast as I could. At home, I broke down and told my grandmother everything. The police came to visit us later that evening. The next day, the sheriff called us to the station. According to him, they checked the house and found nobody there. He also said that my description of the old woman matched the owner of the house, but she had been dead for more than a month. I was shocked and didn't know what to think. The sheriff continued. He showed me photos of children and asked if I had seen them in the house. I replied that I had only heard a scream. Then he told me not to go near that house again and said that there have been cases of missing children in that area. On the way home, my grandmother told me about the old woman. According to her, she had always been secretive, and there were many rumors about her. The neighbors did not like her, and she was hostile to everyone. Before leaving for Chicago, I learned that the neighbors had seen the light on in that old house and had called the police several times, and that the house eventually burned down under strange circumstances. Additionally, people said that during the fire, they heard laughter and screams of children. Many years have passed, but I still remember that house and the old woman with fear. Many years have passed, but I still can't forget my grandfather. He was strong, tall, and a jolly old man. I loved him as much as I was afraid of him. You might think he scolded or hit me, but in reality, he never even shouted at me. He was kind. That's how it seemed to me before, but now it's hard to understand what my grandfather was really like. My father told me that my grandfather had a difficult childhood. When he was young, he was kidnapped by some psychos. They held him in a basement on chains and tormented him, and the worst part was that they starved him. My grandfather himself poorly remembered this part of his life. However, from newspaper clippings, I learned that the police were searching for him for more than 6 months. Journalists wrote that he was found half alive in the basement of an abandoned barn near the bodies of 2 rotting corpses. It turned out that these were the same psychos who had died from a drug overdose. After treatment and rehabilitation, grandfather returned to school, graduated from college with honors, got a job, fell in love with my grandmother and married her, and a little later my father was born, and then I was. In childhood, we often spent time with our parents visiting grandfather and grandmother. They constantly came up with different funny games and told interesting stories. In their house, I could do anything I wanted, except for one thing: play with food or refuse to eat. Grandfather was very strict on this issue and was very careful with food. That's why grandmother always cooked exactly as much food as needed and never offered second helpings. Those were our family rules. My father said that grandfather suffered from traumatic events of his childhood. For the same reason, we rarely stayed overnight. Over time, we started visiting them less often. Grandpa's dementia worsened, and my parents didn't want to bother him without a reason. We only met on holidays, and I noticed some oddities in Grandpa's behavior. But what worried me the most was Grandma. She changed for the worse. She became irritable, absent-minded, lost a lot of weight, had bags under her eyes, and I noticed that she no longer smiled. This was distressing, but time went by, and my communication with Grandpa and Grandma was reduced to rare letters. Then I went to college and moved to another city. Later, when I returned home for vacation, I learned from my father that my grandmother's health had become very bad, and she was now bedridden. My parents didn't want to worry me with unpleasant news, so they remained quiet all this time. My father also told me that a nurse had been taking care of my grandfather and grandmother for some time, but she suddenly left, and now he and my mother are looking for a replacement. Since my parents couldn't go to my grandparents due to work, my father asked me to temporarily take care of the elderly, and I agreed without hesitation. Before I left, my father asked me to make sure that my grandfather didn't walk around the house at night and to lock him in his own room with a key. This request didn't seem inappropriate to me because I knew that some people with dementia are prone to sleepwalking. In the evening, I arrived at my grandfather's house, and seeing their condition, I was very upset. Grandma didn't get out of bed, barely spoke, and spent the whole day looking at the ceiling. Grandpa had lost a lot of weight and looked more like a skeleton than the strong and cheerful old man I remembered from childhood. Taking care of them was not difficult. Feeding, washing, and changing clothes. During all these procedures, I even managed to talk a little with Grandpa. He was very happy that I came to them. Later in the night, I went up to my room and fell asleep with a deep sleep within a minute. I don't remember the exact time, but late at night I was awakened by an unpleasant sound, a strong crunch as if someone was trying to crack ice. Then I heard heavy shuffling footsteps. Slowly getting out of bed, I decided to find out what was happening in the house. Armed with a flashlight, I went into the hallway and saw an open door to my grandfather's room. Inside there was no one. I quietly hit myself in the forehead for forgetting to lock the room and went down to the first floor. I knew it was my grandfather making the noise and he was probably in the kitchen. As soon as I entered the room, my body was shaking with a fine tremble. I saw a strange and at the same time horrible picture. Grandfather in one nightshirt was standing in the corner of the kitchen and holding raw meat on the bones in his hands. He was mumbling, and every few seconds he would sink his teeth into the cold meat. Grandfather was moving unnaturally, like a dog devouring its prey. His teeth were crushing bones with an awful crunch. That's what woke me up in the middle of the night. I cautiously shone a flashlight on my grandfather and called him. My voice was shaking with fear, but I still tried to wake him up. At some point, my grandfather's head slowly and creaked turned towards me. I saw his eyes. They rolled up so high that instead of them there were only bloodshot whites from bulging vessels. They looked at me and into nowhere at the same time. My grandfather's mouth was red from blood, and a piece of meat hung from his lip. Suddenly, my grandfather began to slowly walk towards me. Approaching close, he started mumbling incoherently and lunged at me. I jumped back sharply and ran towards my room. Behind my back, I heard the rapid footsteps and the crunch of bones grinding against each other. I ran into my room and slammed the door behind me, collapsing against it. Sweat was dripping from me, and my heart was pounding wildly. In the corridor, I still heard the indistinct growling and the disgusting crunch. This lasted about half an hour. Then I heard heavy footsteps going towards my grandfather's room. Another half hour later, he softly snored. I couldn't fall asleep. In the morning, I mustered the courage to leave my room. Grandpa was calmly sitting in the living room watching TV, and he smiled at me widely and offered me coffee. I declined and asked him what he was doing last night. Grandpa replied that he slept well and cheerfully added that he had a great dream about a delicious steak with blood. He seemed completely normal. I returned to my room and called my father to tell him what happened last night. My father was not surprised, but from his voice, I understood that he was greatly disturbed. He started to explain that Grandpa used to do strange things before, and that it was a consequence of the traumatic events he experienced in childhood. And now, due to his dementia, he was showing psychological deviations, and that I should be attentive and careful. From that day on, I never forgot to lock both my door and the door to my grandfather's room. I stayed with them for a few more days, and at night I heard my grandfather heavily walking in his room. At first it was frightening and oppressive, but then I got used to it. So we lived in oppressive silence and peace until the illness finally defeated my grandmother. She died without pain and cries. She simply fell asleep and never woke up. The parents were busy with the funeral arrangements, and I was with my grandfather the whole time. On that day, while the preparations for the ceremony were taking place, we stood near my grandmother's coffin. I was very sad, but I held back my tears, not wanting my grandfather to see them. At some point, my grandfather asked me to bring him some water, and I left the room. But when I returned, I was shocked by what I saw. The coffin had fallen over, and my grandmother's body was lying in an unnatural position next to it, while my grandfather sat next to it with his eyes rolled back, biting into her face and growling like a wild animal. I started shouting loudly, calling for help, while trying to bring my grandfather to his senses. And at the moment when I was about to approach him, my grandfather turned towards me and suddenly jumped, grabbing me. He sank his teeth into me, biting through my hand. I felt a heat, and then it became very painful, and I began to lose consciousness. By this time, my father and several relatives arrived. They were able to drag my grandfather away, and I was immediately taken to the hospital. Several days later, the parents decided to take the grandfather to a specialized institution where he was to be cared for by doctors and nurses. The grandfather took the news very calmly. The disease rapidly progressed, and he understood us less and less. Since then, much time has passed, but I still sleep badly at night. Sometimes phantom pains in my hands haunt me, and I hear that nasty crunch of bones. I've long since graduated from college, got married, and spend more time with my family. Even now, when I think about the events of the past, my son jumps beside me. So small, so beautiful, so funny, and so appetizing. This incident happened to me in high school. At that time, I was living with my parents in a small town in the north of the country. It was one of those dying towns where the economy was declining rapidly and the population was slowly decreasing. But everything changed when investors came to this town and built a chip manufacturing plant. This led to the development of the town. The population increased, and new houses were built. My father owned a small construction firm, and thanks to the increased orders, his business grew, which could not help but arouse envy among those around him. He worked from morning until night, and when he saved enough money, he decided to buy a new house. The choice fell on a house in one of the respectable neighborhoods of the town. We arrived at the new house for lunch, I got out of the car and looked around. It was a beautiful neighborhood, with magnificent mansions lining the street, lots of greenery, and everything around was clean and tidy. Then I looked at our 2-story house. It looked brand new. Dad had done repairs in advance, which was evident from the fresh paint on the walls and new windows. Our house exuded a feeling of freshness, which couldn't be said for the neighboring house. I turned my head to the right, and a picture of horror appeared before me. Next to us stood an old dilapidated house, with peeling paint, dirty windows, and a mosquito door swaying crookedly in the wind. All of this caused a feeling of melancholy and unease. It seemed that if I looked at it for longer, I would see clouds gathering over it. It stood out significantly from the overall picture of luxury and prosperity of this neighborhood. My thoughts were interrupted by someone's shout. It was Kevin, my dad's friend and co-owner of his company. His house was on the left side of ours. He waved happily at us and then headed in our direction. A 40-year-old man approached us, blonde, wearing a yellow sweater and yellow pants, and dark red shoes. To be honest, he looked ridiculous. I had met him before, and he was always in a business suit, so apparently he only dressed like this at home. He greeted my parents, and when he saw me looking at the neighbor's house, he patted me on the shoulder and said, "Scary, isn't it? A harmless elderly couple lives there, so there's nothing to be afraid of. We should even thank them, because their presence has lowered the price of our house significantly." I nodded and began to move my things. Moving and arranging the furniture took us half a day. My tired but satisfied parents ordered dinner from a Chinese restaurant and invited my dad's friend's family. The doorbell rang as I was setting the table. My mom was cooking in the kitchen, and my dad opened the door. After a while, 4 people entered the living room. My dad and his friend walked ahead, followed by his wife Patricia and their daughter Lucy, who was my age. They were all dressed in yellow. Lucy and I had known each other since childhood, and she was always a bit strange. As she walked in, she looked at her hands, which were making some kind of pattern. I greeted them, and we sat down at the table. After eating a couple of dishes and feeling full, I decided to talk to Lucy. I was curious why they were all dressed in yellow. After listening to my question, she looked at her father, then scratched her chin and answered in the tone of an old professor. Clothing is not only a protection from the cold, but also a means of self-expression. The color of the clothes we choose can say a lot. One such color is yellow. Surprised by this answer, I asked what they wanted to express with it, to which she replied, "Psychologists claim that the color yellow is associated with the sun, warmth, joy, and optimism. It evokes positive emotions and improves mood." I scratched my head and said that it seems like they are about to experience a happy event. She nodded positively, like a Chinese bobblehead. That's where the conversation ended. I drank my Coke, thinking to myself how strange she was. Then I looked at her parents, who were laughing cheerfully and seemed completely normal. Dinner lasted about an hour, and when the sound of plates subsided and the conversations ended, the neighbors went home and we went to bed. In the morning, I was awakened by a scream. Someone was arguing loudly in the backyard. I looked out the window and saw my father standing opposite the neighbor from the old house, who was standing behind the fence and gesticulating furiously. Rubbing my sleepy eyes and putting on my pants, I decided to go down and find out what was going on. As I approached, the confrontation seemed to be coming to a climax. A 60-year-old man, covered in gray hair, in an old checkered shirt and jeans, was shouting at my father. Dad was trying to calm him down and provide arguments, but the man, spitting with saliva, was getting even more worked up. In the end, the angry old man shouted, "Damn you, damn your house and family. You'll see. I'll show you more. I'll show you, you'll see." Father clearly didn't like it and frowned, trying to say something in response. But the old man didn't give him the chance. He spat angrily on the ground, then turned and stomped loudly back into his house. I later learned from my father that the argument started over the trees near the fence. It was illegal in the state to plant trees near your neighbor. This was what my father was trying to convey to the neighbor, but he suddenly became angry and started shouting. It was an unpleasant situation that left a bitter aftertaste. Although the trees were blocking the sun, and my father wanted a sunny veranda in the backyard, he decided not to continue the conflict. A week went by. I was returning from school, and as I approached the house, I saw my father and mother standing on the porch, leaning over something. I walked up to them and saw that it was an old jug, covered in patterns and inscriptions. The jug was clearly a rarity, and looked like it had been taken from a museum. Then I looked inside, and what I saw was unpleasant. Inside the jug was a dead chick, small and probably 2 months old. It was lying on its back, with its wings spread and pinned to the bottom by large needles, like those grandmothers used to knit woolen clothes. I looked back at my parents, who were discussing with a worried look on their faces. Who could have done such a thing? My mother suggested calling the police, and after a moment of thought, my father pulled out his phone and made the call. The police arrived in 10 minutes. 2 policemen got out of the car and headed towards us. They examined the jug and asked what had happened. We told them everything in detail, to which they asked if we had any conflicts with anyone. Then, after looking at each other, my father nodded affirmatively. He then told them the details of the conflict with our neighbor. The police listened silently, made some notes in their notebook, then took the jug, promising to sort everything out, and headed towards the neighbor's house. When they lifted the jug, I noticed a small detail. There was a small hole near its bottom, and it seemed to me that through this hole, like a vacuum cleaner, shiny particles were being sucked in. Rubbing my eyes, I decided that it was just my imagination. Meanwhile, the police approached the neighbor's house and knocked on the door. It was opened by an old man we knew. After listening to them in silence, he shook his head, denying everything, then turned towards us and gave us a hateful look. The police officer, holding the jug, pointed to it and asked him to look inside. The old man bent down, and when he saw what was inside, he recoiled in fear. He shook his head from side to side, denying everything, then talked for a bit before going back into the house. The police officers returned to us and reported that the old man denied everything. They then said that they would take the jug and study it. They warned us to call them immediately if we noticed anything suspicious. They left. We entered the house. Father sat on the couch, Mother nervously tapped on the closet, and I waited for them to speak. Then Father sighed wearily and said, "Let's forget about it. Yes, our move was overshadowed, but I think with time we'll fix our relationship with the neighbor. Maybe someone else threw the pitcher. Some joker. So for now, don't pay attention to this incident and relax." My mother and I nodded simultaneously, and I headed to my room. Changing after school, I looked out the window. I had a view of the neighboring house, and in one of its windows, I saw the face of an old man. He glared at me fiercely, and I was frightened and hid in the room. Then I decided to take another look and slowly glanced out the window. The old man was gone. I sighed and sat on the bed. This old man really scares me. If he really did throw the pitcher, he is probably crazy. Or maybe he really believes in witchcraft and curses. I nervously scratched my hand. Of course, I don't believe in all this nonsense, but a small feeling of fear is still present. I remembered the time when I met a gypsy in my childhood who decided to tell my fortune. I remember meeting her, but everything that happened afterward was erased from my memory, and my money was gone too. It was probably hypnosis, but after that incident, I approach everything mystical with some caution. After changing clothes, I sat down at the computer and decided to search for information about a jug on the internet. To my surprise, the necessary article came out first on the list, and this is what it stated. Dismembered chicken in a jug. How Athenians cursed their enemies. Ancient Athenians placed curses on their enemies, using a jug pierced with an iron spear and a dismembered chicken. It was believed that the helplessness of a chick would be transmitted to the recipients of the evil spells. The scientific discovery was made by Jessica Lamont from Yale University. The mystery of a clay jug found by archaeologists in 2006 under the floor of one of the buildings in the Agora, the ancient Athenian city square, has been solved. The vessel, which is 2,300 years old, contained the bones of a dismembered chicken. According to the research published in the Hesperia Journal, the unusual find was part of an ancient curse ritual. It revealed to scientists how people in ancient times tried to use magic. Lamont also added that the spear and the chicken played some role in the curse. According to the researcher, such spears possess restraining power and symbolically restrict the abilities of the curse victims. According to the author's hypothesis, the people who created the curse probably wanted to pass on the helplessness and inability of the chicken to protect itself to those people whose names are written on the jug. And the presence of the chicken's head and shins in the vessel may indicate that, by piercing them with a spear, the sorcerers sought to harm the same body parts of their victims. Jessica Lamont, a researcher at Yale University, clarified that the jug contained the head and limbs of a chicken no older than 7 months. I was scared. We are really being cursed. I showed this article to my parents. They looked worried but told me to forget about it and focus on my studies. A couple of days passed. I was watching the old man's house and noticed that he might not live alone. His windows were covered with curtains, but I still sometimes saw the silhouette of another person. One night, I was woken up by a piercing scream from their house, but it quickly subsided. I looked out of the window, half asleep, and saw that the windows of the neighboring house were lit up, and the silhouette of running people was visible in them. But everything quickly calmed down. Then I decided not to pay attention and went back to sleep. In the evening, we were waiting for our father to come to dinner, but he was late. But at around 10 o'clock, we heard the sound of an engine. It was our father. Mother greeted him at the door. He looked very tired. He went into the kitchen and plopped down on a chair. He poured himself a drink and slowly emptied the glass. Then my mother asked him what had happened, to which he replied, "Things have been really bad lately. Unexpectedly, many clients have refused our services. I spent the whole day running after them to find out the reason. But you know what they said? They have a bad feeling, and something is bothering them. Therefore, they decided to look for other developers. I'm really stressed out. Fortunately, I have Kevin. He's always energetic and does half of the work." We ate and then went to sleep. Lying in bed, I kept thinking about whether my father's misfortunes were related to the curse in the jug. With these thoughts, I fell asleep. The next day, I was walking back from school, and as I approached the house, I saw an object on the porch in front of the door. I got scared and quickened my pace. As I got closer, I saw that it was the jug again. It looked similar to the previous one, but had some minor differences. I looked inside and saw a dead chick, with its thighs pierced with needles this time. A terrible premonition came over me. My father was at work, so I called my mom. She came out to see what was going on and saw the jug. Her face twisted in fear. She looked inside the jug and recoiled in horror. We decided to call the police right away, but when my mom picked up the phone, it rang. It was Kevin. He said that there had been an accident at work with my father, and he was now in the hospital. My mom listened to this with a pale face while looking at the chick's pierced legs. Then she hung up the phone and went to get the keys. We got in the car and headed to the hospital. My father was conscious, and he even smiled when we walked in. His legs were wrapped in bandages. My mom approached him and hugged him, asking what happened. He told us that a construction fell on him at the work site, crushing his legs. As he spoke, my mom and I exchanged glances and told him about the discovery. My father frowned and pondered for a moment. Then he asked if we had called the police, and when we said we hadn't, he took the phone and called them. After making sure everything was okay, we decided to go back home for our things. Near the house stood a police car. When we returned, our familiar police officers came out of it. We greeted them and told them about what had happened. Then we walked to the porch, but there was nothing there anymore. "But the jug was right here," I said in surprise. We searched everything around but found nothing. The police questioned the neighbors, but that also yielded no results. Then they left, and my mother left too, promising that Kevin's family would look after me. I gloomily went up to my room and collapsed onto the bed. Thoughts about the jug and the unfortunate incident with my father were swirling in my head. And what if this isn't the end? Maybe something even worse awaits us. My thoughts were interrupted by the door lock. I went downstairs and opened the door. It was Lucy. After greeting me, she said, "My father is busy at the company now, and my mother is cooking dinner for us, so I'll keep you company." I wearily shook my head and let her in. We went upstairs, where I collapsed onto the bed again, and she started drawing something with pencils. After lying there for 5 minutes, I decided to share our story with her. She listened silently, not interrupting her drawing, and when I finished, she didn't ask anything. She just remained silent. I stared at her, but then gave up and decided to see what she was drawing. It was a beautifully drawn cross-section of an embryo chick in an egg. It seemed like the drawing was about to come alive. She had drawn it so detailed. When she finished the drawing, she unexpectedly said, "Do you know that the embryonic chick feeds on the yolk of the egg and oxygen that enters through the pores in the shell?" I shook my head in confusion, and she continued, "By the end of the first week of embryo development, the head and tail are formed. Wings and legs begin to form in the second week. By the third week, the embryo already has feathers, and the eyes become larger. On the 21st day of embryo development, it occupies the entire cavity of the egg and prepares to hatch." I stood there staring at her, trying to understand what she meant, but then she suddenly blurted out, "If you suspect the old man, then you should break into his house and you might find out how to help your father. That's better than doing nothing, right?" And she continued drawing, this time just drawing eggs. I pondered her words, looking out the window of the neighboring house where a pair of angry eyes were staring back at me. An hour later, Lucy's mother brought us dinner, and we ate and went to bed. The next morning, I woke up early. Deciding to take a walk, I opened the door and suddenly stopped. The picture was on the doorstep again. I felt as if I had been struck dumb. I stood in a trance, unable to move, as if a gust of wind would knock me over. Then, coming to my senses, I looked inside the picture. The sight was terribly unpleasant. This time a chick's head was pierced with a large needle. I shuddered as I imagined what would happen to my father. Suddenly my phone rang in my pocket. Startled, I took a couple of steps back, realizing that it was my phone ringing. With trembling hands, I answered the call. It was my crying mother. She said that my father had fallen into a coma that morning, and she didn't know what was happening. Shocked, I hung up the phone and looked at the neighboring house. Lucy's words from yesterday came back to me, and a determination grew inside me. I got up and headed towards the creepy house. When I approached the front door and pulled the handle, it turned out it wasn't locked. I quietly opened the door and entered the house. Standing in the dark corridor and not knowing where to begin the search, I looked around. It was a creepy place. Everywhere there was dirt, tracks, and scratches on the walls, as if they were scratched by some animal. The most unpleasant thing was the smell. It strongly smelled like a dumpster. I decided to go up the stairs to the second floor. Quietly, without making any noise, I went upstairs, and a corridor with 3 doors appeared in front of me. I chose the one at the end of the corridor. Slowly pushing the door, I entered the room, but before I could take a couple of steps, I heard a voice. "If I were you, I would take off my shoes, so as not to make so much noise." I turned around in fright. An old man was sitting in the corner on a chair reading a book. I thought about running away, but didn't see any malicious intentions from the old man's side and decided to speak out. "You," I said with a trembling voice. "Why did you come this far? Why did you curse my father? What kind of damn voodoo crap is this?" The old man silently lowered his book and looked at me, then sighed wearily and put the book aside, saying, "It's not right to stand and talk. There's a chair behind you. Sit down. I have something to tell you." I looked at him in bewilderment, but still decided to sit down and listen to what he had to say. When I sat down, he leaned back in his chair and said, "First of all, I would like to apologize for that incident. It doesn't excuse what I did, but at that moment I had a breakdown. I had too many problems weighing on me, and I just took it out on innocent people. It was my fault that I tarnished your move and ruined your first happy memories. Second, I heard about your father, and I'm really sorry. Judging by the fact that he didn't continue our issue, he's a really good person. And third, I didn't send you those jugs. That's the truth. When the police showed me what was inside, it scared me, and at the same time sobered me up. So I wanted to say—" The door creaked and the old man stopped mid-sentence. An old woman peered into the room. She had gray disheveled hair and wore an old gray sweater, but her eyes caught my attention. Her gaze wasn't focused but wandered in different directions. Apparently she was ill. "Yes, dear," said the old man, and she handed him an old button. He stood up and took it from her. After that she closed the door, and the old man continued, "Sorry, that's my wife. She recently became ill with a mental illness, and my life has changed drastically since then." He sighed, tiredly rubbed his temples, and sat down. Everything fell into place. Now I understood why there were those screams, those strange scratches in the hallway, and finally, why the old man had a breakdown. Sadness washed over me, and I felt sorry for the old man. He paused for a moment and then continued, "I really didn't send you those jugs, but based on my extensive experience, I would advise you to think. Who benefits if something happens to your father?" I fell silent and started to think, then stood up and apologized to the old man. He waved his hand, indicating there were no problems. After that, I left their house. On the street, I took out my phone and dialed Lucy's number, asking where she was. She was at home. Her parents were not there. Then I asked if I could come over and if she could help me with homework. She agreed. A few minutes later, I knocked on the door. She didn't come out immediately, so I knocked again, but then remembered that she was strange and decided to wait. She opened the door after 10 minutes and invited me in. I thanked her for opening the door so quickly, to which she just rolled her eyes. We went to her room. The yellow color struck me. The room had yellow curtains, a yellow carpet, and the bed linen was white, but there were yellow chicks printed on it. Also, chicken-shaped toys were lying everywhere. I looked around in amazement. My gaze was drawn to the eggs on the shelf, and as I approached, I realized they were made of marble. I don't know why, but I discreetly put one of them in my pocket. Then we sat down and started doing homework. After about 10 minutes, I told her that I needed to go to the bathroom. She didn't answer, so I looked at what she was doing. She was drawing an egg embryo again, but the chick inside was almost formed. I realized that she was already too focused and quietly left the room. I snuck into the kitchen and found a mop, then returned to Lucy's room and propped her door shut. I figured that would delay her for a while. Then I started exploring their house, went through 2 floors, but found nothing suspicious. After standing and thinking for a moment, I remembered about the basement. Soon I found the entrance. It was next to the kitchen. The door was locked. Then I found tools in the pantry, and with a little effort, I picked the lock. I opened the door and went down. The room was lit by small decorative lanterns. The walls were covered in unusual ancient patterns. In the corners, there were statues of frightening bird deities. And most importantly, in the center stood an altar and a large jug. When I first entered, it seemed to me that I heard the sound of a heartbeat. But when I approached the altar, I realized that the sound was coming from the jug. On closer inspection, I recoiled in fear. The jug was breathing. It expanded and contracted like a chest during breathing, and the sound of a heartbeat thumped in my ears. Thump, 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 thump. My breathing slowed. I wondered what to do next. Should I break it? If I break it, nothing terrible will happen. But my thoughts were interrupted by a terrible scream. I turned around and saw Kevin running towards me with a scream. I was cornered and thought it was the end for me. When he ran up to me, he grabbed me by the throat and began to choke me. Everything in my head was mixed up. Everything was happening very quickly. The pain in my neck and the lack of oxygen made it difficult to think. Instinctively, with one hand, I began to search my pockets, and with the other, I tried to push Kevin away. Suddenly, I found a marble egg in my pocket, the one I took from Lucy's room. With all my strength, I threw it into the jug, causing it to shake and fall to the ground. A piercing cry echoed. Kevin let go of me and cried out in fear, falling to his knees. At that moment, a black mist flew out of the pitcher, shimmering with a golden sheen. It leaned over the room like a genie and let out a piercing scream before disappearing into the air. Kevin fell to the ground convulsing and screaming in agony, then lost consciousness. I lay on the ground in shock, not knowing what to do next. Suddenly, Lucy burst into the room, saw the scene, screamed, and ran towards us. To my surprise, she ran past her father and fell to her knees in front of the shattered pitcher. She wept, tears pouring from her eyes, repeating over and over, "My egg! No, my egg!" I quietly and discreetly made my way out of the basement. Once outside, I called the police and waited. As soon as I hung up the phone, it rang again. It was my mother, telling me that my father had regained consciousness and was okay. I was genuinely relieved. After hanging up, I looked around our street and our house. Finally, my gaze fell on the old man's house. He stood on the porch and our eyes met. He smiled and nodded at me, and I nodded back. Then I looked up at the blue sky, remembering what I had just gone through, and thought that no one would believe me. But that's not important. What's important is that it's all behind me now. "Hey, Michael, are you listening to what I'm saying to you?" my boss exclaimed. His name is David. He is a tall, strong man of around 50 years old. Many women are always running after him because he is damn handsome and rich. He has a sports car, expensive watches, and shoes. But most of all, the boss loves his voice. He loves to teach. How he annoys me. "Stop. What is he saying to me?" "I'm listening," I replied indifferently. "Listen, Michael, my patience has limits. You must understand, this is my last warning. If it weren't for your older brother, I would have fired you a long time ago." "I'm grateful and apologize for my behavior," I said with a hint of sarcasm. But apparently the boss didn't understand me and spoke more gently. "Michael, you're 30. Do you understand? Your brother is very worried about you. You're a smart guy. What happened to you? Hey, are you listening to me?" The boss was still relentless. "I'm listening," I mechanically replied. All this time I was indifferently watching the spider web on the window. A fly had just landed in it, and now a spider was slowly approaching it. Another victim. I too am in the web, in the network of this vicious system, the so-called corporate work, a slave of the financial pyramid. The boss still didn't give up. "I hope you heard me this time. Okay, go." I gave David an indifferent, almost glassy look and left his office without hurrying. Instead of going to my workplace, which was one floor above the boss's office, I slowly made my way to the exit. I didn't care that it was the middle of the workday, and I needed to work. All my thoughts were only about one girl. As I was in the parking lot, my phone rang. "What's up?" I said indifferently without even looking at who was calling. "Michael, where are you?" My older brother's voice came through. "Eddie, not now, okay?" I replied. "Are you busy? Are you at work? Has my friend David not fired you yet?" My brother continued to ask questions. "I'm busy right now," I nervously replied. My brother wouldn't stop. He kept bombarding me with questions. "Michael, we're really worried. Mom asked about you. I can't understand what's happened to you. Admit it, you've become addicted to drugs?" "No, see you later," I answered shortly. "Wait, Michael, come visit us this weekend." My brother didn't finish his sentence when I hung up the phone and got into my car. I could understand their concern. Just a year ago, I was a decent, calm, slightly introverted but responsive guy, but over the years I've become unrecognizable. I did well in school, graduated from college with honors, and thanks to my brother, landed a great job. The first few years were typical. Home, work, dinner with parents, and my brother's family on weekends. I didn't have friends, maybe a couple of acquaintances, and the lack of a girlfriend or personal life didn't bother me at all. I thought living like this was better than forcing myself to socialize with anyone. I had a similar attitude towards girls. I simply couldn't understand how anyone voluntarily ties themselves down with the bonds of marriage or simple relationships, only to live their whole lives as if they were in captivity. I was convinced that I was born for some greater and grander purpose, rather than to become a plankton in this swamp called everyday life. Sometimes I feel like I was born in the wrong time. Lying for hours on my bed, staring at the ceiling, I imagined myself becoming someone better, someone who saves the world, someone great, almost a superhero. I understand that perhaps I have too high an opinion of myself, but I thought for sure that I didn't deserve to sit in an office and respond to boring messages. Changes began a year ago. I often bought various things online, antique clocks, vinyl records, or books. Oh, I love to read, and could never pass by those who offered books. For some reason, they attracted me with incredible force. Not new ones that smell of fresh printing ink and are sold in bookstores, nor online books. I was always drawn to already read, old books with yellowed pages. Most of the time, I bought them without even looking at the title or contents. And that's what happened almost a year ago. I saw an ad for old books for sale. Fortunately, the seller lived near my house, and I thought it would be better to go and see his collection myself than to pay for delivery. I was greeted by a gray, stocky man in his 60s, who immediately led me to a small room where stacks of books were lying in boxes. At first, my attention was drawn to scientific literature, but then I noticed that the seller had a lot of strange and even incomprehensible objects. I started to go through the stack of books, not in a hurry. The whole world seemed to stop existing for me. My eyes lit up with interest, and my hands almost trembled. But I knew that to avoid overpaying, I needed to remain calm and ask about the price carelessly. The seller apparently managed to see my interest. "These books are old, but each one is valuable," the man said. "Why do you think so?" I asked. "Because you won't find such books anywhere else. They are exclusive," the seller replied. "Where did you get these books?" I continued. "They were inherited from a distant relative," the man replied dryly. "How much do you want for everything?" I asked, picking up a few books. "A few dozen," the seller said. After bargaining a little more and paying for the books, I hurried home with my purchases. After lunch, I eagerly set out to read. That's how I behaved every time I came across very old books. The anticipation of contact with something ancient excited me. The most remarkable thing was that one of the books had no publication date. It looked more like a notebook, where letters were carefully written by hand. The cover was so worn that it was impossible to read the title. That's the book I decided to start with. Although the handwriting was neat and even, some parts were very difficult to read. My gaze kept stumbling over carelessly written words and unfamiliar terms. At first, I just skimmed through the lines, but then I started taking out my phone and looking up the words I didn't understand. After reading 15 pages, I flipped back to the beginning and started reading again. This time I read attentively. Everything written there not only appealed to me but even beckoned me. The further I read, the more it became clear that this was indeed some old handwritten book. Moreover, it was written by either a wizard, a necromancer, or an occult fanatic. From the first pages, the book told about the author himself, who complained that he was born not in his era. All his thoughts and aspirations significantly outpaced the time, so he decided to live long enough to be needed and able to live fully. The book seemed to read my thoughts and was able to penetrate into my soul. I stayed up late reading this book. I learned that there is a doctrine that allows anyone to become initiated in the mysteries of the world and the universe, allowing an ordinary person to become practically immortal, living from century to century, absorbing age-old knowledge and wisdom, and waiting for their time to manifest their destiny. I reread some pages several times, amazed at how similar the author's thoughts were to my own. And on the first day, I read almost half of the book. I stopped only after reading the carefully written lines. Read my next words carefully. If your desires are limitless, and you are seeking a path to uncover your true destiny, then I challenge you to accept this call. However, be prepared to sacrifice your current life for your future life. Prepare yourself for the trial that awaits you. Cleanse your mind and body of everything that weighs you down and shrouds you in doubt. And then, you will be ready to hear and see what is given only to the chosen ones. Follow my words and instructions. Take on the challenge that will change your life forever. I shuddered as I read these lines 3 times. I was ready. I knew that every line in this book was meant for me. I looked at the time, and dawn was soon to come. I gently closed the book and put it next to the clock. As I lay down to sleep, I had already decided that I would start following all the instructions described in the book from the next day. One of the rules in the book was to eliminate all communication with people for a few days, which is what I did over the weekend. I turned off my phone and locked myself inside the house. Even when it was time to go to work, I continued to be idle, occasionally reading other books. Over the course of several days of my seclusion, my door was knocked on several times. I assumed that it was either from work or my brother looking for me, or maybe both. In the several years that I had worked in the office, I had never been late without reason. You know, I was such a good employee. And now I disappeared and didn't answer calls. I'm sure my handsome boss and brother were very concerned. But I didn't care at all. All this time, I lay there and thought about how luck had finally smiled on me. I would be able to uncover the secrets by fulfilling my destiny. What is an ordinary office job compared to this? After completing the first task, I sat down to continue reading the book. I was very excited and nervous, turning the pages one after the other. The book described a ritual that would allow one to attain conditional immortality, to live for centuries. The author enticingly described the ritual and partially touched on its preparation, as well as briefly sharing what it was like to live for several centuries. I read the book without stopping until I came across the lines. Do not be afraid. Sometimes the choice may seem unimaginable, but you must overcome fear and doubt. Remember, you need to choose the right objects and people to perform the ritual. It is a complex science, and therefore I will describe everything in detail in another parchment with explanations. It's called First Steps. Read it carefully so as not to make mistakes. It describes the formulas for performing the ritual. I fell into a small stupor. What? Another book is needed? I rushed to the table where I kept the other books I had recently purchased. The books, although old, clearly displayed their titles, and they were all not what I needed. Nervously, I began to recall whether the seller had any more books left. With these thoughts, I set off again to the house of that seller. Are there any books left? I asked from the doorstep. "What books?" the man asked, surprised by my behavior. "I bought some old books from you last week," I impatiently continued. "Several books. I need the continuation of one of them. Another volume." The man looked at me intently, as if trying to remember, and then he spoke. "I remember you. You asked a lot of questions, but wait. I don't have any books here. They're in another house, in the countryside, near the forest. I'll bring them tomorrow. Maybe there's what you're looking for." "Today," I interrupted loudly. "Today. I'll pay whatever you ask." The last sentence particularly pleased the man, and he agreed. An hour later, I drove the bookseller to the old abandoned house in my car. I drove silently, gloomily watching the road. The man tried to get to know me or talk, but I answered briefly. I didn't want to talk to him. After 4 or 5 hours, we arrived at the old abandoned house. The seller led me through the backyard to the garage and opened it. My heart started beating even faster for some reason. I cautiously and slowly entered the garage, which from the inside looked more like a room, the lair of either an alchemist or a necromancer. The relatively poor furnishings faded into the background, as all my attention was captured by various symbols on the walls and some seemingly occult objects. "Here are all the books that are left," the man said. "How many do you want?" I impatiently asked. "Wait, friend. I need to count them and then I can—" He didn't finish because I interrupted him. "Just tell me the price," I said, emphasizing each word. There was a moment of silence in the room. "Okay, I understand. You really need them. Fine, take them," he said. He named the price, and I agreed without hesitation. We loaded the books into the car and drove back to the city. On the way, I asked the seller, "The house and garage seemed a little strange to me. Has this house always been yours?" "No. The house used to belong to my uncle, a wild man, you know. It was just as strange. He disappeared 50 years ago. We thought he died somewhere. But it turned out he was living nearby in that very house. He left it to me in his will. But I don't think it's worth living in. Once I sell everything that's left inside, I'll tear it down. It's a creepy house. I don't like it." That same night, I lay down on the bed and opened the book I had found. The very same one I had been looking for. It really described all the details of the ritual. To some, what was written might have seemed bizarre. To others, just a joke. But I took it all more than seriously. Not only did I not doubt any of the details, but I was already making plans on how to make it all happen. The book stated that 7 girls were needed. This would probably be the most difficult part. But I decided that I would definitely manage. With each passing day, my fascination with rituals grew stronger. I devoted every spare minute to reading and rereading books, notes, and journals. I unquestioningly followed all the recommendations of the authors of the books, and every day tried to bring that special day closer. The day when I would become great, a superhuman. It has been almost 6 months since I bought these books. As usual, I woke up early in the morning, stretched out, and began scanning the room for a sign. The book said that a sign would help me understand when to start preparing for the ritual. I even flinched when I saw that the wooden mask hanging on the wall above the bed had changed expression. According to the instructions in the book, I had made several such masks and hung them on the walls in different rooms. One of them, which hung in the bedroom, had become different. The hole that served as a mouth used to be round, but now it stretched into a smile. This was definitely a sign. The one I had been waiting for. This meant that the first girl I needed was already somewhere nearby. All I had to do was find and capture her. The first thought that came to my mind was to open my laptop and start searching. It was unclear where or how, but I followed the impulse. Without even washing up, I rushed to the table and turned on my laptop. I entered "Where to Meet a Girl" into a search engine and started reading what appeared on the screen. Then intuitively, I clicked on one of the dating websites. It took me some time to understand how it worked, fill out my profile and start searching. I looked through several options until I found her. There she was. Almost trembling, I clicked on her profile and started reading. I wasn't interested in what she wrote about herself. I was looking for information on how to meet her. The girl I chose shared a lot about herself in her profile, and attached at least 10 photos. I was sure that fate was guiding me by the hand, giving signs and directing me where I needed to go. Within a couple of minutes, I had already written my first message. I had no experience in communicating with women, but I was confident that fate would guide me on what to do and how to act. We exchanged phone numbers almost immediately and agreed to meet. That same evening, I headed to the designated address, without any plan, but knowing what I had to do in the end and how the date should end. The next sign was given to me by a mask hanging in the living room after 2 months. This time, some unknown force compelled me to go on one of the popular social media sites. At first, I scrutinized my recently created profile, and then I typed in a surname in the search bar. I scrolled through the many profiles that appeared in the search results and chose one. The page stated that the girl provided massage services at home. The pinned message displayed the price and contact phone numbers. It took me a week to schedule a massage session, during which I was extremely nervous and anxious. I rented an apartment in the city for a day to conduct the massage session, planning to pass it off as my own. Inviting the chosen masseuse directly to my place would have been very risky. The massage itself was very pleasant, especially considering that it was my first in life. At some point, I completely relaxed. Then I realized that relaxing was not advisable, and I tensed up sharply, doing everything quickly and precisely, as required by the book. The third sign, with a changed expression, was given to me by the mask again after a month. I also trusted fate. This time, I just got in my car and started driving around the city. It was already late when I decided to go to the supermarket. Walking aimlessly through the aisles, I mechanically picked up some groceries and headed to the checkout. The feeling that something was about to happen didn't leave me. 2 people were standing in line in front of me at the checkout. My gaze easily slid over the girls and women around me until it stopped at the saleswoman at checkout. I knew it was her. I exchanged a few words with her, took my groceries, and returned to my car. Then I stayed in the parking lot waiting for her shift to end. The next sign I saw was already a week later, and again I trusted fate, then another sign, and another. Everything went smoothly and without problems. But then everything quieted down. More than 2 months passed, and fate no longer gave me the desired signs. Waiting, I became somewhat inert, and gradually lost interest in everything except my idea of performing the ritual. And even today, when my boss scolded me once again for the indifference I showed in my work, I wasn't really listening. Then I left work and went home. I heated up some ready-made dishes in the microwave, then put them in a large plastic basket. Next to it were bottles of water. Satisfied with the collection of groceries, I picked up the basket and headed for the bedroom. In the room, I moved the table against the wall and, as if reluctantly, leaned over to lift the edge of the thick carpet lying on the floor. Skillfully and quickly, I rolled it up, then pulled out a set of keys from my pocket. Slowly, savoring the moment, I started sorting through the keys until I found the right one. On my knees, I began to unlock the lock. After that, I lifted the lid leading to the dark void below. Immediately, I heard female voices from below. "Shh, quiet," I said. The female voices quieted down a bit, but it was still audible that someone was sobbing or even quietly whimpering. I pulled a long and thick rope, one end of which was tied to a metal grate covering the entrance to the basement, while the other end hung down into the basement. Tying a basket to the free end of the rope, I began to carefully lower it through the largest opening in the grate. I said briefly, "Eat." There was some commotion from below, causing the taut rope to tremble from time to time. "Let us go. We won't tell anyone anything," a pleading female voice sounded. "Of course, I'll let you go, but not yet," I replied. When the rope stopped shaking, I pulled it up, retrieving the empty basket. Then I carefully began untying the knot. Closing the lid and straightening the carpet, I breathed a sigh of relief and headed to the bedroom. Today, I completed another stage described in the book, and I could read it further. This time, the description was brief. Leave a will and pass on our cause to other chosen ones. It was one of the last pages of the manuscript. I felt some relief that I was able to reach the end of the manuscript, albeit almost a year later. On the other hand, I felt some anxiety. Before, I acted as if I were following a script, doing everything that was written in the manuscript. But what should I do now? Of course, I still had to finish the preparations and perform the ritual. But when? When would the sign come? Lazily and without hurrying, I opened my eyes and looked at the wooden mask hanging over my bed. Whether from joy or something else, I shuddered. The expression on the mask changed again. The sign. I waited for it. Now the main thing is to let go of my consciousness. That's how fate will lead me to the final girl. While I was waiting, the phone rang. I answered, and was pleasantly surprised. It was Evelyn, my childhood friend. She had left 2 years ago, and now she had finally returned to the city and wanted to meet with me. In recent years, Evelyn and I had grown apart, but we occasionally kept in touch. And now she showed up again, and I suddenly wanted to renew our relationship. It was all very simple. I invited her to my place, and Evelyn agreed. She arrived closer to the evening. I opened the door, was polite and friendly, and we talked a lot, and for a long time, reminiscing about the past and laughing. I treated her to dinner and gave her a little wine with a small addition. And when she fell asleep, I moved her to my cozy basement with the other girls. The final ingredient is there. Thus, all preparations were completed. It's time to begin, but tomorrow, I will do what I have been preparing for a long time. I was physically and mentally exhausted, so I fell asleep as soon as I touched the pillow. I woke up in the early morning. It was still night outside. I got up and turned on the desk lamp to write. It was my will, the one the author of the manuscript suggested me to write. I had already decided who to leave my possessions to, including the manuscript and other valuable books. Let it be that same bookseller. Who knows, maybe someone chosen from the same market will be able to look at the books and appreciate what is written in them. When it started getting light outside, I decided to prepare for the ritual I intended to perform this evening. Part of the props had been waiting for their hour for a long time. All that was left was to put everything in its place, read the instructions once again, and finally do what I had dreamed of my whole life. It was still light outside when I finished the final preparations. Checking the time once again, I headed to prepare dinner for my captives, but this time with a small secret. As I lowered the basket into the basement, I heard moans again. Evelyn, like every new captive in the basement, was still not used to her fate, crying and trying to scream. But today, it didn't bother me. Eat, Evelyn, don't scream. I'll explain to you soon what's going on. The faster you eat, the faster we can talk, I said to my captives. This time I didn't bother to lock the basement, but I left the room to double-check that everything was perfect in my preparations. I returned to the room with the basement a little over an hour later. "Well, ready?" I asked loudly. There was no response. "Excellent," I sneered. It took me a lot of time and effort to retrieve the sleeping girls from the basement. In my mind, it seemed much easier than it was in reality. I carried each of the girls into the largest room of the house, where I spent all day preparing a place for the ceremony. The windows were draped, and there were at least 100 candles burning throughout the room, making the air feel heavy. The only piece of furniture was a single chair. There was also a large bird cage covered tightly with an old blanket under the window. On the floor was drawn a 7-pointed star, which I carefully replicated from a book. I then arranged the girls in the corners of this star. First, I laid each one on her back. Then I spread their arms out like in a crucifixion and tied each arm to the metal bars driven into the floor. I also fixed their slightly spread-apart legs in the same way. Actually, I had prepared dresses for the girls that, in my opinion, perfectly suited the occasion. I had planned to dress the girls while they were asleep, but after expending almost all my energy to carry my captives from the basement to the house, I decided that the clothing they were already wearing would suffice. After assessing the resulting atmosphere and being satisfied with it, I changed into the black hooded cloak with a belt and tied it with a thick rope that I had purchased almost 6 months ago. Then, I sat on the only chair in the room and waited for the girls to wake up. Afraid that they might spoil everything with their screams, I decided to gag each one's mouth. No one was supposed to spoil this day, this ritual, and my transition from a mere mortal to a chosen one. It was already approaching midnight when the girls began to regain consciousness. I watched as they blinked heavily and then tried helplessly to free their hands. I only regretted one thing, that there were no spectators here and now. My heart was racing with anticipation of the ritual. And then I smiled, thinking that the girls, while still here, could be the audience. And they won't tell anyone about my secret later. The girls, increasingly coming to their senses, began to get nervous, trying to make sounds and free their hands. I put on a large hood that almost completely hid not only my face, but also my entire head. I pulled a book out of my pocket, in which a ritual was described, and started to quietly read something. The girls only heard some indistinct scraps like, "Accept this sacrifice from me. I give you my flesh and life." I muttered something under my breath for quite a while. The girls behaved differently. Some still tried to free themselves, while others silently cried, waiting for their inevitable fate. After finishing muttering the words, I slowly and dramatically took off my hood and began to remove the knife hanging from a leather cord around my neck under the cloak. It looked unusual, a long blade, a carved black handle. It was not at all like kitchen knives. Rather, it resembled some kind of souvenir version. I approached one of the girls and knelt in front of her. I swung the knife. Then I approached the other and did the same in order. The last one was my Evelyn. She was crying. She was beautiful. Now that I was finished with the girls, according to the instructions, I had to take fire and cleanse my body. After repeating the words written in the book several times, I lit the flame and performed the very last action that would open the way to the mystery of this world and make me a superhuman. Long live I. The chosen one has come to this world. My name is Eddie. I am a police officer and was called in for a very important case. In the suburb, a house caught on fire. The firefighters found bodies. According to reports, something strange happened there. The area was cordoned off, and there were many reporters here. Forensic experts were working in the house. The house did not burn down completely. When the flames erupted, neighbors called the fire department, and the fire was quickly extinguished. However, the scene in one of the rooms could shock anyone. In the largest room, there were 7 charred bodies, all female, tied up and arranged in a circle. Many of them have already been identified. A metal box with the girls' documents and strange books was found in the basement. Some of them were considered missing. We also found out the owner of this house. He was the main suspect in this case. His name was Michael. My partner reported that they had called his relatives and had already put out a wanted notice. No one saw him leave the house. At the police station, I studied the surveillance camera recordings from neighboring houses and nearby shops several times, and was surprised that we didn't notice what this Michael was doing all this time, as if he was hidden from our sight. And now no one could find him. He disappeared, as if he never existed. I studied all the camera recordings again, and reread the books found in the basement, these strange books, but there is something attractive about them, as if they are written about me. Well, now all these books are tangible evidence. The first time I stepped onto a basketball court was back in my childhood. My father was a fervent fan of the local team, and as soon as I could walk, he enrolled me in a children's basketball program. Since then, I have regularly played basketball. Now, this dreadful incident happened to me towards the end of high school. I had spent the entire night playing video games. Rushing to get ready for school in the morning, I threw my uniform into my bag, but forgot to pack my sneakers. This led to fatal consequences. When the bell rang to signal the end of class, I grabbed my bag and headed to the gym. While changing, I realized that I had forgotten my sneakers. Chastising myself for my carelessness, I asked the coach if he had any spare sneakers. He sent me to the storage room, which was located next to the fire exit. As I approached the storage room, I was overcome with a sense of dread. I pushed the old, worn door open and walked in. A cloud of dust rose and I started coughing. When the dust settled, I surveyed the room for my sneakers. It was dark, and old equipment was scattered everywhere. Deflated basketballs, a broken basketball hoop, rags. After a couple of minutes, I found them lying in the far corner, under some small boxes. This was a pair of old white sneakers. They looked intact but worn out in places, and they were just my size. There was something written on the sole, and as I tried to make it out, I headed towards the exit. In the light, I was able to read the inscription. It said that whoever wears these sneakers will be cursed. At first, I smiled and thought that some people have nothing better to do. But suddenly, for the second time, a strange feeling of unease came over me. I was about to throw them away, but the coach called out to me, and I, shrugging it off, put on the sneakers and ran to the game. Fortunately, the training went smoothly. I changed my clothes and put the sneakers back in the closet. On my way home, I tried not to think about the incident, but those words kept swirling around in my head. I tried to distract myself, but the strange feeling of heaviness in my chest wouldn't let me rest. When I got home, I told my mother about the sneakers. She laughed and tried to calm me down, saying that someone was just fooling around. Gradually, as we talked, I began to forget about what had happened. Wishing my parents good night, I went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night. I didn't know why, but my heart was pounding like crazy, and it was hard for me to move. I tried to calm down and figure out what was happening to me. The room was very dark, but over time I was able to begin to make out the outlines of objects. Suddenly, I heard the bed creaking, and it seemed terribly ominous to me. Then I felt something sit on my legs. The weight crushed them, sinking deep into the mattress. At first I wanted to scream, but I couldn't open my lips. Subconsciously, I was terrified. Trying to move my legs, I felt movement on them, like a disgruntled cat that doesn't want to get off its owner's lap. Oh my God, what is this? Mom, a quiet, muffled cry escaped my throat. I lay there for about 5 minutes trying to calm down. Then I gathered myself and reached for the nightstand, grabbing my phone. My hand was trembling badly, but I managed to turn on the flashlight. Slowly, very slowly, I moved the light towards my legs. And finally, I saw it. A disgusting creature resembling slime was staring at me, comfortably situated on my legs. It was the size of a large dog, covered in spots, and had a pair of eyes and a small mouth with fangs. He looked into my eyes, grinning like a chef looking at an uncooked dish, waiting for the moment when it can be eaten. I stopped breathing in horror. My hair stood on end, and all I wanted to do was jump up and run. But my sixth sense told me that if I got up, it would be the end of me. I turned off the light and dialed my mother's number. Ringing, then another. Come on, pick up the phone. Finally, my mom answered, her voice groggy, asking what happened. All I could do was whisper, "Help." Within seconds, my parents burst into the room. They turned on the light and looked around in fear, not understanding what was happening. Then, seeing that I was just lying there, my mother rushed to me and asked what was wrong. I concluded that they couldn't see him. I briefly told them what had happened, while glancing at the monster on my legs. He clearly didn't like the light, or maybe he didn't like other people. I never understood. He squinted and shook his head disapprovingly. My parents didn't believe my story, thinking it was just a nightmare. But then my father looked at my legs and noticed that they were unnaturally sunken into the mattress, and also the movements of the blanket as the creature writhed unhappily. His reaction frightened me. He jerked back, falling backwards and crawling away. His eyes were full of horror, the reaction of a man who did not believe in the supernatural but suddenly faced with something unreal and frightening. Then my mother screamed, covering her mouth in fear. She also noticed the anomaly. She grabbed my hand tightly and held me close, tears streaming from her eyes. My father finally came to his senses. He stood up and scratched his nose in thought. Then he went out and returned with a phone, dialing a number. He waited a long time for an answer. After speaking to someone, he hung up and came over to me. Sitting down, he hugged my mother and put his hand on my shoulder. It calmed me down a bit. We waited. Half an hour later, there was a knock at the door. My father went to meet the guest, and after a while returned, leading an elderly man. He looked around the room, approached me, and began examining my legs. My father told me that he was his acquaintance, a professor. Suddenly he jerked back. His reaction was similar to my father's. Muttering something, he crossed himself. My father was surprised, as he considered him a staunch atheist. Finally, the professor regained his composure. He questioned me in detail about everything, and then concluded that it was all related to a curse on my sneakers. He suggested waiting for morning to see what would happen at dawn. Time passed slowly and painfully, but with the support of my family, I endured. When morning came, the creature wriggled unhappily and disappeared. I got up, feeling heavy in my legs, and walked around the room. Last night seemed like a nightmare. Not knowing if it would return, I had to take action. The professor went in search of information, while my parents and I went to get sneakers. When we arrived at the school, my coach happened to be passing by, and I dashed towards him. Surprised, he asked what happened. That's when I asked him about yesterday's sneakers. I couldn't wait to rush to the storage room, but he replied that he threw them away yesterday in the trash. What? I felt like I was sinking into the ground. Then my father asked where the garbage dump was. When we got there, it turned out that the garbage truck had taken all the trash. Crushed by this failure, we returned home. Later, the professor called. He questioned various experts, psychics, and exorcists, and found out that the surest way was to burn the sneakers. If that didn't work, then we had to rely on God. We explained the situation to him. Then he suggested that we go to the city dump and search for the sneakers. He promised to bring people with him and also join us. A week passed. It turned out that the creature comes around midnight, but only if I am in a horizontal position. If I walk or stand, it doesn't appear. But the scariest thing is that it rises higher and higher with each time, and I'm afraid to even imagine what will happen when it reaches my head. Another month passed. I'm standing in the middle of a pile of garbage, with my parents nearby, dirty and exhausted. I'm clearing the rubble with my last bit of strength. Yesterday, the monster approached my neck, and I don't understand how it happened. Every time I tried not to lie down or sit at night, but something prevented me, and the joyful creature climbed higher and higher up my body. It's probably the end. One more time, and that's it. I could feel it. It was night, and I was sorting through garbage with my mother nearby to support me. Suddenly, I heard a joyful scream. It was my father. I turned around and saw him jumping up and down in the distance, waving his right hand and holding something white in his left. I realized he had found a pair of sneakers and I felt happy. I threw everything aside and ran towards him, jumping over obstacles, heading towards my father. But when I was almost there, something grabbed my leg and I fell. At the same time, thunder roared and it started to rain. What the hell? Suddenly, I felt a familiar pressure and the creature began to materialize on me. Oh my God. I turned to my father and yelled with all my remaining strength, "Burn it!" My father, stunned by what had happened, took out a lighter, which we carried with us, and set the sneakers on fire. At that moment, the creature bent over me. Our eyes met, and I saw devilish anticipation in its eyes. It opened its mouth and was about to devour me, but suddenly it screeched and dissolved like a water bubble. I was covered in disgusting liquid, and the pressure disappeared. The sneakers were burning. With a hiss from the soles, like chewing gum stuck to a shoe, a dirty clump of slime fell off. I lay there, my heart pounding as if it wanted to jump out of my chest. The rain was pouring on me, washing away the slime. It was cold and damp, but I smiled because this nightmare had finally ended. It's a scary story that happened to me when I was a child. At that time, I often played with a ball in the yard. One day, after playing, I sat on the grass and looked at the house across the road. It was old and battered, and the local residents called it the haunted house. The owners were also unusual people. They didn't talk to anyone or greet anyone. And as soon as I thought of them, they came out from around the corner in the direction of their house. This was a married couple with a child. The mother, a tall blonde in a dress, was leading, followed by her husband, a short, full man, and at the end, barely keeping up, was a boy about 6 or 7 years old. And when they were almost at the door, I heard the sound of something soft falling. On closer inspection, I saw something shocking. A hand, waving its fingers, lying on the asphalt. It was the boy's hand. He had thrown it away like a toy. Noticing the loss, he bent down, picked it up and put it back in place. When the initial shock passed, I assumed that it might be a prosthetic, but something else happened. Apparently the hand didn't immediately return to its place, and the boy had to exert himself. And when he pulled again, his eye fell out. Suddenly I felt like I was drenched in cold water. I was terrified. Suddenly the mother stopped and turned to check on the child. Seeing what had happened, she looked around and then in my direction. Sensing danger, I quickly looked away. It was very scary. My hands were shaking. I felt looks directed at me. After a while, I decided to look around. Nobody was there. Trembling, I got up and ran home. There, after catching my breath, I calmed down and told my parents about what had happened. Of course, they didn't believe me, but the story didn't end there. I started noticing that someone was following me. When I played in the yard, someone watched me from the windows across the street. When I was in my room, someone stood in the yard and hid behind a tree. I was so scared I couldn't sleep. My parents reassured me that it was all just my imagination. I was lying in bed one day and I heard a noise outside the window. I got up to check, but suddenly saw a face pressed against the window. I screamed and my parents came running at the noise, but there was no one at the window. I remembered the face. It was our neighbor. I told my parents about it and warned them that if I disappeared, they should look for me in the house opposite. My parents nodded doubtfully and put me to bed. I woke up to the sound of plates and someone's conversations. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was in the kitchen. My body and legs were tied, but my hands were free. In addition to me, there were 3 other people there, my neighbors. I wanted to scream, but the woman beat me to it, threatening to kill me if I didn't calm down. She pushed a plate towards me and told me to eat. I felt sick. The plate was full of eyes. The husband and wife didn't pay attention to me and continued to eat. Someone pushed me from the side. I turned in tears and saw a boy. He stood with his head bowed, holding out an old, moldy donut. I looked at him and saw sad, unhappy eyes. Without saying a word, he continued to hold out the donut. But suddenly the woman, seeing what was happening, jumped up and rushed to me. She untied me and dragged me to another room. It was an old laboratory with bottles and various ingredients. Dragging me to the cabinet, she pulled out a jar filled with bright blue liquid. She told me that if I drink it, I will never die or grow up and become her second son. She handed it to me and ordered me to drink it. I started to resist, wriggling and falling to the floor. Then she called her husband, and he pressed me to him so hard that I couldn't move. The woman approached, opened the jar and tried to pour the liquid into me. But suddenly the boy jumped up and broke the jar. The woman screamed in rage. The boy ran out of the door. She wanted to run after him. But suddenly the police burst into the room, warning everyone to stay in place and raise their hands. But the woman and man suddenly jumped up and attacked the police. The police responded by firing, and I hid under the table. When the noise subsided, a police officer approached me, picked me up and took me to my parents. Later I asked about the boy, but he was never found. The cafe was crowded, but there was one free table by the window. Approaching it, I pulled out my laptop and phone, then sat down and ordered a cup of espresso. While waiting for my order, I looked around. The place exuded a romantic atmosphere. It was decorated with flowers and soft cushions, paintings hung on the walls, and classical music played in the background. Couples sat around holding hands and talking about something. The girl I was interviewing chose this place for our meeting. I wondered why she chose this cafe. I wasn't expecting much from this interview, but Jenna, my editor, had been nagging me for a week to go and find out what had happened to the poor girl. "I sense a good story," she said. "Our magazine published various stories about people, but tried not to deal with anything mystical or paranormal, only what was backed by facts. But this time, they made an exception. With skepticism on my face, I agreed, and here I am sitting here sipping coffee." After about 10 minutes, a 20-year-old girl walked into the cafe. She was of medium height with red hair, wearing a medical mask and large dark glasses on her face. She was dressed in a blue jacket and jeans. She walked somewhat awkwardly, slightly hunched, which was strange because she had a good figure. But apparently something was weighing her down, perhaps some emotional stress she had experienced. Spotting me by the window, she headed in my direction. "Hello, I'm Caitlin. Are you a reporter from Faces magazine?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes, I'm Michael Chow. Please sit down," I replied. She sat down carefully, looking around awkwardly. I called the waiter over and ordered another cup of coffee. After a moment of awkward silence, I cleared my throat and asked, "So, what story do you want to tell me? Please don't be shy and start from the very beginning." She didn't rush to speak, just looked sadly out the window. Then, sighing, she slowly took off her glasses and mask. She then raised her head and looked me in the eye. I involuntarily gasped and leaned back. Somewhere behind us, a waitress dropped a tray. Couples began to look around in confusion, but then, upon seeing us, they covered their mouths in fear. The girl had 4 huge and terrifying scars on her face. 4 red-yellow stripes crossed her face diagonally, starting from her forehead and ending at her chin. It narrowly missed her eyes, only splitting her eyebrows. It seemed that the wounds were fresh, but I couldn't say for sure. It looked as if a huge beast with claws had left these marks on her once beautiful face. Soon, people felt ashamed of their reaction. Everyone in the cafe turned away and pretended not to notice anything. The girl noticed this and awkwardly covered her face with her hair. Then she said, "Although it seems crowded here, compared to other cafes in this area, it's relatively empty. Plus, this place is near my house." She then adjusted her hair again, uncovered her face, and continued, "What do you think? How long will these wounds take to heal?" Probably a week," I awkwardly replied. "6 months," she said, putting on a medical mask. "Seriously?" "Yes. It all happened 6 months ago. The wounds won't heal. Usually it's because of viruses or bacteria. But tests haven't found anything, and doctors just shrug their shoulders. In the end, I came to the conclusion that wounds obtained under otherworldly circumstances should only be treated with non-traditional methods. So in a week, I'm going to Venezuela to see a famous shaman." At the word otherworldly, I raised an eyebrow in doubt, and she noticed it and said, "My story will seem unreal to you, and only these scars are my proof." She looked out the window and continued, "Look at all these people going about their business, thinking they are rulers of this world. That reality is all the buildings around us, cars, everything we see and feel. For example, this hand." She raised her hand in front of her eyes. "It's my hand. It's real, so I am real. But what if there is another reality, and until a person faces it head-on, they will always be a skeptic? I'm not asking you to believe me, but I wanted to share this with someone, because I am overwhelmed with the same feeling that Pythagoras may have had when he realized that the earth is round. Then his reality was turned upside down, and he discovered a new wonderful world. but I discovered a world filled with nightmares. And like in that horror movie where you scream at the screen to warn the main character that a monster is waiting for him under the bed, I want to scream to the world that there is another world, and it is real. The phone was lying on the table and recording our conversation. The girl took a sip of coffee while I was chewing on what I had heard. To me, it seemed like a typical case of seeking fame and attention, but when I noticed the scar peeking out from under her mask, I began to doubt. So I decided to listen to her story until the end. She finished her coffee and placed the cup on the table, and then, taking a deep breath, she began her tale.
At the time, I was studying at the local college. It was one of the best in the city, by the way. There was a dormitory attached to it where I lived with 2 of my friends. On that fateful day, a scream rang out. "Spider, spider, spider!" shouted a tall, beautiful blonde, jumping onto the bed and pointing to the floor in alarm. At that moment, I was sitting at the desk, working on my term paper. Glancing at my friend, I silently took a piece of paper, caught the spider, and threw it out of the open window. "When are you going to grow up, Jessica? It's just a little spider. If it wanted to eat you, it would have called its friends," giggled my other friend, Emma, a short girl with short hair and big round glasses. She was sitting on the bed, reading a book. "You wouldn't understand. When I was a kid, my brother threw one on the collar of my shirt. It was just a nightmare. After that, I had to see a psychologist for a month," Jessica said, sounding pitiful. "If you don't introduce me to a good guy, I'll throw 5 of them on you right away," Emma continued, joking. Jessica snorted, got off the bed, and walked up to the mirror to freshen up. She had another date today. I wondered who the lucky guy was. Glancing over her shoulder at her friend, I continued working on my coursework. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was for Emma. She picked it up, talked about something, and hung up. "My parents called. They said my grandma urgently flew to California for some business. They asked me to look after her house and cat," Emma said, clasping her hands together and pleadingly looking at us. "Please, girls, can we go together? I'm scared to go alone." "I'll pass," said Jessica. "I have a date today." "I don't mind. I don't have any plans," I replied without taking my eyes off my work. Emma then walked up to Jessica and started pulling her dress. "Oh, please, come on, Jess. Let's have a party of 3. You have dates every day anyway. Postpone it for a couple of days. Your guys won't disappear anywhere," Emma said pleadingly, continuing to fiddle with her dress. Okay. You convinced me. I'll go with you, but you're treating me to dinner," said Jessica. Emma nodded happily and started getting ready. I also put my coursework aside and we headed to Grandma's house. We arrived there in 15 minutes. After paying the taxi, we looked around. The house was beautiful and well kept. It was located in a quiet area surrounded by many flowers and greenery. The facade of the house was in the style of American classicism, with columns on the porch and tall pillars supporting the balcony on the 2nd floor. When we approached the porch, Emma started looking around for something, and then said, "It should be here," and approached one of the pots that were in front of the house, bent down and lifted it up, pulling out a key. I smiled. Who else does that? Emma opened the door and we walked in. We were greeted by a spacious hall with high ceilings and an antique chandelier. Around the hall were rooms, and we looked into each one. They all looked warm and cozy. In the living room was a large sofa covered with soft fabric and surrounded by colorful pillows. Paintings and photographs hung on the walls, and a carpet lay on the floor, adding to the comfort and coziness. Jessica flopped onto the sofa, burying herself in the pillows, while I sat in the armchair next to it. Suddenly, we heard meowing, and a black cat entered the room. After surveying the uninvited guests, he walked to the sofa and jumped onto Jessica's head. "Get out, you bad cat! Go away!" Jessica pushed the cat away and he jumped down, settling on the floor. "Apparently the owner is unhappy that you have rudely sprawled out here," Emma laughed. "Come on, Mortimer, let's go feed you." The cat, upon hearing about feeding, headed to the kitchen with Emma. Meanwhile, we buried ourselves in our phones, wondering what to do. Half a day passed as we lay on the couch, discussing various topics. We ordered pizza for dinner. When it arrived, I went to pay for it, and on my way back, I bumped into Jessica, who looked like a mischievous child. She was leaving Emma's grandmother's bedroom, and upon seeing my disapproving look, cheerfully said, "Look what I found." In her hands was an old book. I shook my head disapprovingly and said, "You're crazy. Why did you go into her bedroom?" "Oh, come on. There was nothing interesting in there except for this book. It was lying on the shelf, and I don't think Emma's grandmother will mind if we read it." We went into the living room and started to study the book. It was an old, worn book with a leather cover, and on the cover were strange patterns that framed the skull of an animal with horns. It might have been a goat, but I couldn't tell. The book exuded an antique and mystical aura. But before we could open it, Emma walked into the room. She exclaimed, "Wow, what is this?" and snatched the book from us. Emma was quite the bookworm, and the new book immediately caught her interest. I was also interested, so I peered over her shoulder. On the first page, a male figure sat in a lotus position with a goat skull for a head and flames burning in the empty eye sockets. The rest of the book contained text in an unfamiliar language, accompanied by various animal illustrations and occult symbols. "The text is written in Latin," said Emma. "I studied Latin in high school. I may have forgotten some things, but I can understand the meaning of this text. It describes rituals for summoning spirits." We glanced at each other. Jess smiled. Apparently she was having fun. Soon I had a thought. It seems that people didn't have much to do before. I was thinking, what do we usually do on winter evenings? Either we watch TV or we surf the internet. But imagine what people did in the Middle Ages. Or some Russian writer like Dostoevsky, for example, sitting in his taiga and waiting for spring. I would write some kind of opus in their place. "Yeah, like how to wash red hair in 10 ways, Emma joked. I threw a pillow at her. She deftly dodged. And at that moment, Jess thought about something, rubbing her chin, and then said, "Listen, maybe we should try to perform a ritual. I think it will be fun." Emma and I stopped fooling around and looked at the silly blonde who was smiling happily. "I don't know. Do you think it's worth it? I feel a little scared," I replied. "Well, from a scientific point of view, it's all nonsense, so I think there's nothing to be afraid of," said Emma, adjusting her glasses. "We need to choose the simplest ritual that doesn't require any special ingredients." She flipped through the book and stopped at a picture of a scary witch with a large hump. She was dressed in a long dress and wore a hat. The witch's face was very wrinkled and even puckered, with deep folds around her eyes, forehead, and mouth. Her eyes were red and shiny like those of a rat, and her teeth were crooked and yellow. It was a drawing, but the artist had conveyed every detail precisely. The old woman held a basket of flowers in her hand. "I think this ritual is the simplest," she said. "We need to arrange the candles in the shape of a pentagram, put a piece of bread, a pinch of salt, water, sugar, and grain on the rays, and also put any living creature in the center. Even a plant will do." "All right, I saw the candles in the closet. The rest of the ingredients are also available. The only thing left is any living creature." "Maybe we should put a cat," Jess suggested. "I don't think anything will happen to him." "Poor kitty," I said. "Yeah, forget it, this is all nonsense," Jess said. Emma and I nodded. Then we went to look for candles and other things. 15 minutes later, everything was ready. It was already late in the evening. We had eaten beforehand. Then, feeling full and content, we started the ritual. We cleared the center of the room, moved the couch, removed the coffee table, and folded the rug. Then we arranged the candles in a circle with a star in the center. We put the ingredients on each ray and the cat in the center. Although he wasn't particularly keen on sitting among the candles and kept trying to escape, Emma gave him his favorite treat, and he calmed down for a while. When everything was ready, Emma sat at the base of the star, with Jess and me on either side of her. She opened the book and began reciting the spell. I looked around the room. We had turned off the lights beforehand, so the only light came from the candles, creating a mysterious atmosphere. Emma continued reciting the spell, which was quite long. Suddenly, I heard some rustling and strange noise. I started to worry and looked at Jess. She was no longer smiling, but nervously looking around. Emma, on the other hand, didn't notice anything and seemed to have fallen into a trance, her speech speeding up. I leaned in and looked into her eyes. She didn't blink and stared at one point. Her speech accelerated even more, as if it would reach its climax soon. Suddenly, wind blew from an unknown direction. The light from the candles began to flicker, creating a creepy flicker. The closet door began to open and close on its own, creating an unpleasant rumble. We could hear footsteps and whispers around us, and the more Emma sped up, the clearer they became. I looked at Jess, who was cowering in fear and backing away from the circle. The cat that was sitting in the center, meowed in fear, jumped out of the circle and disappeared into the darkness. My heart was pounding. I realized we had made a mistake and something needed to be done. I don't know, maybe my intuition told me, but I realized that the spell needed to be interrupted urgently. So I grabbed Emma by the collar with all my strength and pulled her back. She was shaken and tumbled halfway across the room. The spell was interrupted. Suddenly the candles went out, and I heard a furious scream. I covered my ears with my hands, trying not to go deaf. The footsteps and whispers intensified, and I felt anger and rage in them. Suddenly, everything fell silent. I lay curled up on the floor, trying to calm down and regulate my breathing. Jess was crying in fear somewhere in the corner. I gathered my strength, stood up, and turned on the lights in the room. The living room was in chaos. Pillows were scattered all over the room. The contents of the dresser were on the floor. Pictures were torn off the hinges. And what horrified me the most was that the photographs were turned upside down. On the couch, hugging her knees, sat Jess with tears in her eyes. Emma sat in the corner of the room, rubbing her head and looking around, trying to understand what had happened. Then she stood up and asked in a frightened voice, "What the hell happened? I blacked out in the middle of the ritual. Where did all this mess come from?" "We'll tell you later. First, we need to calm Jess down," I said, approaching my friend and hugging her. The three of us then headed to the kitchen where Emma made coffee, and we gradually regained our composure. Then I finally recounted the events to Emma. She looked at us in shock, unable to believe what was happening. "It can't be. It just can't be." She shook her head in disbelief. But after looking at our faces and seeing that we were completely serious, she began to doubt herself and asked, "Could it be the candles? There are all sorts of fumes and hallucinations." "No, what candles? This was all real. The furniture was flying around the room. I heard that whisper in my head. And where did the wind come from? The windows were closed." Jess finally spoke up. Silence fell. We sat there for a while, discussing what had happened. Then I suggested that we tidy up the living room and go to bed. We quickly restored order there. After hanging the pictures back up, we gathered around the photos. It was the biggest mystery of all, who had turned them upside down. Emma speculated, "This looks like occult symbols, when you sort of deny something, like Satanists turning a cross upside down." Well, I admit it's pretty creepy. We finished cleaning, then returned the infamous book to its place. The bedroom was on the second floor. Upon entering the room, we immediately noticed the huge bed in the center of the room. This bed could accommodate several people. We decided to sleep together, especially since Jess didn't leave our side, afraid of being alone. We didn't turn off the light. After changing clothes, we lay down on the bed. I couldn't fall asleep for a long time, thinking about what had happened. I was gnawed by a feeling of worry and anxiety, which gradually turned into fear. Even though the light was on in the room, it seemed to me that something was wrong, as if someone was watching us. I reacted to every rustle outside the window, to every click that seemed terrible to me. Suddenly, I heard snoring from the side. It was sudden, and at first I was scared, but quickly realized that it was Jess. She was lying in a hug with Emma and sleeping peacefully. Seeing my friends sleeping peacefully somewhat dispelled my fears. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. I stood in the middle of a long and dark hallway with doors. I looked around, trying to understand how I got here. Then I approached the nearest door and pulled the handle. It was locked. Suddenly, I started to feel very thirsty. My throat began to itch and scratch. I needed to urgently find something to quench my thirst. I started running down the hallway, pulling on the handles of every door, but they were all locked. I was already desperate, but suddenly one of the doors creaked open. Joyfully, I rushed inside. In the center of the room stood a small fountain with clean and transparent water. I ran towards it, but when I was almost there, suddenly blood started gushing out of the fountain, staining everything around it. A strong smell of iron appeared, and the blood in the fountain began to clot. I almost vomited, and I ran back out into the hallway. The thirst did not go away, and my throat itched like crazy. Scratches even started appearing on it. I continued running, trying to find water, but in every room there were fountains with blood. And when I had already given up and was ready to drink the blood, I found an open door at the end of the hallway. I went inside and saw a table. On it were small cups. Looking into them, I found the same ingredients we used in the ritual, namely bread, salt, sugar, grain, and water. I saw the water and eagerly reached out, but suddenly, with a loud crash, the door closed behind me. I turned around and saw the same old woman from the picture. She screeched furiously and lunged towards me. I tried to dodge but didn't have time. She grabbed me by the throat and began to choke me. I tried to resist, but when I looked into her scary red eyes, I was filled with horror and fear, and I felt weakness in my body. When I thought I was going to die, I woke up. Emma was sitting on top of me, choking me. Her eyes rolled back so that only the whites were visible. I grabbed her hands, trying to break free and scream to wake her up, but not even a squeak came out of my throat. Jess, who had woken up, came to my rescue. She wrapped her arms around Emma's torso from behind and pulled her away. Finally, she let go of me. In a panic, I felt my throat. Everything seemed normal. Emma was still struggling in Jess's embrace, so I grabbed a glass of water that was sitting on the couch and splashed it on her face. That helped. Her body went limp, and she regained consciousness. Not understanding what was happening, she looked around in fear. She saw that Jess was holding her, and I was looking at her in fear. She seemed to understand what was going on and began to cry. When I regained my composure, I pulled Emma towards me and hugged her. Jess sat down next to us and patted her on the shoulder. Our tender embrace was interrupted by flashes of light. We looked around. The lamps on the ceiling began to make noise and turn on and off. Suddenly, the window opened and a strong wind blew in. The light finally went out. We were horrified, clutching each other, watching these strange events. The books on the shelf began to fall one by one. With a loud crash, a vase broke. The large wardrobe next to the bed began to shake, as if someone was trying to escape from it. Suddenly, the entrance door opened with a loud creak. In the hallway stood the silhouette of the old witch. We heard a rat squeak. The witch raised her hand and pointed at us. We froze in shock and horror, and then, looking closely, realized what the figure in the hallway was made of. It was hundreds, thousands of rats, intertwined with each other, constantly moving, creating this terrible monster. Suddenly, the old woman lowered her hand, and the thousands of rats scattered on the floor and ran towards us. We began to scream in terror, trying not to step on the rats, then jumped up and ran out of the room. There was only one thought in our heads: to escape from this house as soon as possible. We went downstairs, I grabbed my bag from the living room, and we ran out onto the street. Around was silence. The street was absolutely empty. There was no noise that had been in the house. I pulled out my phone. It showed that it was 3 a.m. We were standing in our pajamas and wondering what to do next. Call the police, but they won't believe us. The only option left is to call Emma's grandmother, but she didn't answer the phone. Then we decided to go back to the dormitory and called a taxi. It arrived in 10 minutes. The taxi driver silently looked us over and added, "What do we have here, a pajama party?" But seeing our frightened and serious faces, he remained silent for the rest of the way. Finally, we arrived at our room. I turned on the light switch, but it didn't work. It was suspicious. Jessica, thrilled to be home, plopped down on her bed. It was dark, so I turned on the flashlight on my phone and aimed it at Jess. She was lying on something soft, like wool. Saying that the bed was softer than usual, she smiled happily. I felt my scalp go numb with horror. All because I remembered watching the BBC once and they showed unusual insects. The host asked the audience if they thought it was a ball of wool, then he took a stick and moved the ball, after which it began to spread out and it turned out to be a colony of spiders. I prayed to be wrong, but suddenly the hairs on Jess's arms started to move. She didn't notice it right away, but then spiders started crawling on her, and I heard my friend's loud scream. She jumped up and started jumping and brushing off the spiders with her hands. In a wild dance, she crossed the room, and then, with horror in her eyes, she passed out. I managed to catch her, and together with Emma, we dragged her to the hall. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the face of an old witch in the window. I was seized with terror. The old woman wouldn't leave us alone. We carried our friend to the illuminated hall. Dawn was approaching, and we decided to stay put for the time being. In the morning, Emma's phone rang. It was her grandmother. Emma, with tears in her eyes, told her what had happened. Then her grandmother ordered us to return to her house, assuring us that we would be safe during the day. And she urgently flew in on the next flight and would be home by evening. So we did. We woke up Jess and took a taxi back to the house. The day passed and nothing strange happened. It was already 6 o'clock, evening was approaching, and we were sitting in the living room, nervously waiting for Grandma to arrive. Hearing the sound of the opening door, we met a 60-year-old elderly woman. She had gray hair and large earrings on her ears. She was wearing a white shirt and a blue skirt. It was evident that she was in a hurry. Without greeting us, she went to her bedroom, then returned with a book and said, "Well, young ladies, we need to repeat the ritual that you conducted. So Emma, go to the kitchen and gather the necessary ingredients. And you, Blondie, go for the candles. And quickly, we have little time." Then she suddenly turned to me and hugged me. "Thank you. You may not know it, but you saved my granddaughter when you interrupted the ritual." I looked at the old woman with incomprehension, and then she explained. "The ritual requires a sacrifice, and if there isn't one, the demon will take the soul of whoever is reciting the spell." From Emma's words, I understood that the cat sensed the danger and ran away. Otherwise, my granddaughter would have been the sacrifice. "You interrupted the ritual and thus angered the demon. If it's not appeased, it will continue to pursue us." I was in shock, not understanding when words like demons appeared in my reality. I began to feel dizzy, and the grandmother, seeing that I wasn't myself, grabbed me by the hand and led me to the living room. Jess was already sitting and arranging the candles, and soon Emma returned with cups in her hands. We arranged all the ingredients as required, but I was worried about who would be the sacrifice. Then the grandmother left the room and returned with a large pot of fern. It dawned on me, and I remembered the words in the description that even a plant could be offered as a sacrifice. I slapped myself on the forehead. We were so stupid. Why did we put the cat there? But back then, it was just a game for us. Everything was ready. We were very nervous. Grandma sat with a book at the base of the star and ordered us to sit next to her and mentally ask for forgiveness from the demon. Then she began to recite the spell, falling into the same trance that Emma had. The whispering and footsteps of someone returned. I looked at my friends who were repeating the words to themselves with pale faces. I also started to say to myself, "Forgive, forgive." The wind blew again, causing the candle lights to flicker. Grandma's speech accelerated, the whispering became louder. 4 figures stood as if in a trance when finally Grandma shouted the final word. The light went out. There was complete silence. Nearby, I heard sighs of relief. But then in the darkness, a very loud and nasty laugh sounded. Something flashed in front of my head, and I felt a terrible pain. I was thrown back, blood covering my face. I screamed in pain. Someone turned on the light. Jessica screamed in horror. Emma called someone on the phone. All of this merged into an ocean of blood and pain for me. Finally, I lost consciousness.
The waitress was standing next to me and wanted something from me. But I didn't react, and as if in a trance, listened to this story. Finally, I came to my senses, and the waitress asked me if I wanted to order anything else. I declined, and I asked Caitlin, "It sounds like a fantasy, but why do I believe you? And why are my hands shaking so much? Probably because I'm telling the truth. Caitlin tried to smile, but with her scars, it only came out as a scary grin. The next day, I found myself in the hospital, where I stayed for about a month. Then for several months, I traveled with my parents around the country, looking for a plastic surgeon, but it was all in vain. That's when I started exploring other options, searching for shamans, clairvoyants, and witches. Most of them were charlatans. I visited many mysterious places that were written about on the internet, and I saw a lot of things. Do you have any other evidence? It would be nice to corroborate the story with them. She thought for a moment, then replied, Maybe, but we'll have to go somewhere, and it might be dangerous. Are you ready for this? I remembered the story and looked at the girl's scar. What I thought would be interesting, and I answered decisively, Yes, I'm ready.
When I was 12 years old, my parents and I went on a trip to India. I rode elephants, fed monkeys, and learned a lot about the culture and life of the inhabitants of India. I loved flowers, and my father started giving me orchids every day. They were everywhere in India. I was happy. One day, we went to a small village, and there was an ancient temple nearby, which my father really wanted to see. My mom stayed with me, and we waited for my dad to come back. My dad came back late at night. He was dirty but happy. He said he found a map in the temple that leads to a lost city, and tomorrow we will go with him to see the ruins of an ancient civilization. Early in the morning, we set off into the jungle. Soon we had to leave the car and walk. My parents often traveled, and they knew how to behave in wild places, so I wasn't scared. By noon, we reached an old rope bridge that hung over a wide river. My dad checked its strength and told us to follow him. The bridge was made of ropes, but had strange inscriptions and paintings on it. My dad said it was an ancient lost language of an ancient civilization, which meant we were going in the right direction. The river seemed strange to me. It was unusually white, like milk. And the bridge gave me goosebumps, not because it could break or something like that. It seemed to me that the bridge was alive. It was as if it was waiting for us and observing us as we walked on it. In the evening, we reached the foot of a small mountain and decided to set up our tents here. It was dangerous to go at night. My dad set up the camp, and my mom and I gathered kindling for the fire. I noticed that after we crossed the river, the insects on this side of the jungle stopped bothering us, and there were fewer animals and birds, but I didn't pay much attention to it. I slept poorly at night, had nightmares, woke up several times and went out of the tent to breathe, and all this time it seemed to me that someone was watching me from behind the trees. In the morning, my father woke me up and said that my mother had disappeared. He told me to take a few things with me, and quickly, we set off to find my mother. My father said he had found footprints that led to the other side of the mountain. From my father's face, I understood that he was confused and scared, and I myself was ready to cry at any moment. We quickly walked around the mountain and were surprised to find a monstrously large arch, an entrance leading deep into the mountain. My father told me to stay outside. He gave me our family revolver and said not to be afraid. After a couple of hours, when the sun was already high, I suddenly felt that someone was watching me. I looked towards the cave and was shocked. I saw my mother, or someone who looked like her. She quickly hid in the cave. I couldn't take it anymore, and so, armed with a flashlight and revolver, I went into the cave. The cave was eerily quiet and very spacious. As it turned out, this place was not exactly a cave, but a wide and long room, along the walls of which stood columns to the ceiling. The walls were adorned with drawings that horrified me. They depicted people who looked like animals holding severed heads in their hands. I decided to call out for my parents, but no one answered my screams. I was scared, and I wanted to leave the cave as quickly as possible. but I had to find my parents, and so I began to descend an old stone staircase to the center of the room. As I was almost descending, I heard a weak voice. It was my father. He was very scared. My father looked at me with fear, and as I was about to approach him, he screamed for me not to go down and to run away to the rope bridge. At that moment, I saw a large shadow behind my father, which grabbed him and dragged him into the depths of the cave. I stood there not daring to go any further and not trying to return. I was lost, shocked, and full of fear. I don't know how long it passed, but suddenly I heard my mother's voice, then my father's. They were calling me to come with them. But I continued to stand there, and at some point, I heard my parents' voices again, but they were very quiet. Almost whispering, they begged me not to step into the center of the room and to run out of the cave. I gathered myself and ran away. I don't remember how I crossed the bridge. I don't remember how the rescuers found me, but after some time, I woke up in the hospital. Later, I was told that several months had passed since we left for the jungle, and it was a miracle that I was alive and well. My parents were never found, nor was the bridge, river, and cave. Many years have passed. I have stayed in India and work as a doctor in a local hospital. And every year on the day when my parents disappeared, I continue to find orchids at my home that my father used to give me. Suddenly, the light turned on, interrupting my sleep.
"Everyone get up!"
yelled the guard on duty in our block with a hoarse voice. I heard the creaking of mattresses and the buzz of activity in the neighboring cells as all the prisoners began to get up from their beds. I slept very poorly again tonight, having another nightmare. It was hard to breathe, as if someone was choking me. It's a terrible feeling. Oh yes, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Leah, and as you may have guessed, I am a criminal. Would you like to know what landed me in jail? It's quite simple. I was caught breaking and entering, entered someone else's home, woke up the owner, and didn't have time to escape. And the funniest part is that the owner of the house turned out to be a local judge. It's all my damned luck. I was apprehended, and since I had already broken the law several times before, I was quickly sent behind bars. It has been over a year since I was put in prison, and to be honest, I quickly adapted to prison life. Nobody bothers me, and I try not to get involved in other people's business. Most of the time, of course, I am alone, but that's even better. However, lately I have had a strange feeling of unease. I cannot describe it in words, but it's as if I am being followed, and sometimes I overhear others whispering about me. And these cursed nightmares. I am starting to think that I am going insane, which is very nerve-wracking. There was a strange incident last week. I was working in the laundry room and didn't notice that I was alone in the room. Then I heard a noise behind the door, more precisely, laughter. At first, I didn't pay attention to it, you know how it is. I was lost in my thoughts. But then I listened more carefully and was surprised. It was a child's laughter. But how did a child get here? This is a prison closed off from the outside world. I became curious and went to take a look. I walked slowly, holding my breath, and as I approached the door, the laughter became louder and more hysterical, and at some point, I even began to hear sobbing. When I cautiously opened the door, I found no one there. I was scared, and I quickly left the laundry room. In the following days, I heard that damned laughter several more times. In my cell, during a walk, in the prison hallway. I tried not to pay attention, but almost every time I was startled with fear. And then, the laughter suddenly stopped. I thought it was just my temporary auditory hallucinations, possibly caused by stress and lack of sleep. However, things were much worse than that. For the first time, I saw her in the reflection behind me. a blonde woman grinning wickedly at me. I was frightened and turned around, but there was no one behind me. Second time, it happened in the shower. I felt someone touch my neck. There were many other women in the shower, and among them stood a blonde woman. The third time it happened in my cell, I woke up in the middle of the night because I couldn't breathe. I distinctly felt cold hands squeezing my neck. I opened my eyes and saw her. In the corner of the cell, she was looking at me angrily. I couldn't sleep anymore, and in the morning, noticed bruises on my neck. Since then, she started following me wherever I went and whatever I did. I asked her many times, "What does she want?" I begged her to leave me alone, but it was all in vain. Because of this, I became very irritable, acted recklessly, and argued with one of the prisoners from the so-called prison gang. As a result, they beat me up, and I ended up in the medical block. I woke up the next day feeling sore all over my body and dizzy. When I tried to get up, I heard a woman's voice ask, "What happened to you?" Turning my head, I saw an old woman on the adjacent bed. She looked strange to me, covered in tattoos even on her face, with long gray hair and skinny as a skeleton. She appeared to be around 70 years old. But what caught my attention the most were her eyes. She had strange pupils, as if she were blind and looking not at me but somewhere in the space next to me. The old woman smiled strangely and said to me, "Do you think I'm blind? No, child. I see everything." I remained silent and didn't answer her question. However, the woman continued speaking. "You don't have to speak. I know you did something wrong, and now you're paying for it. I see a dead person next to you." I was shocked, and despite the pain in my body, I turned to face the old woman and asked her, "What? You see her?" The smile disappeared from the woman's face. This time she looked directly at me and replied, "Yes, I see her, over there in the corner. She's been waiting for you for a long time." I didn't know what to say. My mouth was dry, and I continued to stare at the old woman in shock. "Are you surprised? But why?" the woman asked me. After thinking for a moment, she continued, "Tell me what happened. Maybe it will make you feel better." At first, I didn't want to tell her, but after what happened to me, I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I decided to reveal what I had been hiding for a long time and trying to forget. "I was always beautiful," I began my confession. "I was the only child in the family, so my parents never refused me anything. I had everything that other kids could only dream of. I grew up in luxury and allowed myself a lot, including arrogance towards people. That's why I didn't have real friends. There was only Wendy, a sweet and very smart girl. She lived in the neighboring house and we went to the same school. Wendy helped me with my studies. I didn't really want to study and often just copied from Wendy. In reality, I only needed this from her. I didn't consider Wendy my friend. Years passed and we continued to communicate. At some point in life, she really became my friend. Later, Wendy went to university, graduated with honors, and everyone said she had a brilliant future. And I was not lucky. My parents died in a car accident, and my life changed dramatically. I dropped out of university and ran away with a guitarist, but he left me and I returned to my parents' house. I tried to work, but to no avail. I was frequently fired. Wendy, on the other hand, was doing well. She landed a job at a large private company and loved to talk about her work. Honestly, listening to her was unbearable, but I had no other friends, so she was my only option, and of course, I pretended to be interested. And then she introduced me to her boyfriend, Mike. He was tall, blonde, handsome, smart, kind, and rich. That damn Wendy hit the jackpot. She had everything, a great career, a new big house, and a fiancé. I have had several unsuccessful romances and a bunch of unpaid bills, but I didn't understand why everything turned out like this. Why did she get everything and I got nothing? I am much more beautiful than Wendy, so why should I live worse than her? I couldn't accept this. I couldn't let her be happy. I had a simple plan. I actively seduced Mike, and after a couple of months, he gave in. We met secretly in roadside motels. I really liked Mike. After a while, I started feeling sick and found out I was pregnant. I told Mike, but he chickened out and said he couldn't leave Wendy. They were getting married soon, and everyone was waiting for them to get married. He didn't want to leave Wendy. That's when I decided to push him. I came up with another plan. I asked Wendy to come over, secretly fed her sleeping pills, and then set the house on fire. It's very simple. No Wendy, no problems. Mike will only be mine. That's what I thought back then. I managed to hide my tracks, so the police didn't suspect me. But Mike was heartbroken. He really loved Wendy, that cursed blonde, and I was just a pretty toy. Besides, Mike felt something. He couldn't prove it, but he suspected me. In the end, despite the fact that I was carrying his child, Mike left me. He just walked away. A few months later, I gave birth to a girl. At first, I tried to be a mother, but eventually gave up and gave the child away. I couldn't bear to see her. She reminded me of Wendy. She had light hair like her father. And then I started messing around with drugs, quickly ran out of money and started stealing. And that's how I ended up here, in prison. I finished my story and looked at the old woman. She was silent for a long time, and then lay down on the bed and said, "It's too late to cry. Your friend is waiting for you." Only then did I feel tears on my cheeks. I cried and couldn't stop. But do I have the right to cry? In a few days, I returned to my cell. Everything was the same as before, except for one thing. The blonde in the corner who watched me with hatred in her eyes. I know I won't be able to get away from her. She's always there waiting for me. And I'm scared. When I was 6 years old, my parents loved to travel and quite often left me with my grandmother. I wasn't particularly against it because I really loved her. She was always kind and caring, treating me to different treats and telling me interesting stories. My grandmother lived in a small suburban village right at the edge of the forest. It was an hour's drive from my home. We arrived at her house for lunch. A ginger cat greeted us on the porch, lazily lying on a rocking chair. As we passed by, he raised his head like a guard dog guarding his territory. This amused me so much that I ran up, grabbed him, and hugged him tightly. At first, he resisted, but then he gave in and let me squeeze him. Mom called me and we went inside. My grandmother happily came out of the living room and greeted us. Behind her, like a procession, the cats came out. Many cats. I tried to count them, but lost count at 11. Mom, seeing this scene, sighed and asked where they all came from. Grandma waved her hand and said they were her guests and not to pay attention to them. Mom looked at them doubtfully, but then nodded and put away my things. Then she said goodbye and left, and my grandmother and I went to feed the cats together. To feed such a crowd, Grandma had to cook a whole pot of porridge. She took out the bowls, laid them out, and filled them. There were 13 bowls in total. They were all the same size, except for one. It was twice as large as the others, and the porridge could also fit in it twice as much. We carefully laid them out on a rectangular table, 6 in a row, and one largest one at the head of the table. Then Grandma took a bell and rang it. The cats ran into the kitchen and each took their place. The last one to come was that same ginger cat that I was petting on the porch, and he sat at the head of the table. Only after he started eating did the other cats start eating. I was surprised to see this and asked Grandma if this cat was the commander. Grandma nodded and said that it wasn't exactly like that, but it was roughly like that. After the subordinate cats finished eating, they waited until their commander finished. Then they jumped off the table and each went about their business. A week has passed, and besides the unusual feeding, I noticed a couple of other strange things. Firstly, the smell. Once I was going home with a friend to her aunt's. She also kept cats, not as many as my grandmother, but still quite a few, to be precise, 5. So when we entered her home, there was a terrible smell. At my grandmother's house, there was no smell at all. It smelled of roses and mint. The air was pleasant and fresh. Secondly, the ginger cat. He was my favorite. I often played with him, took him for walks, and fed him all sorts of goodies. One day, while walking down the street, I passed by a house where a huge dog lived. Seeing me, he began to jump and bark furiously. I was frightened and hastened my step, but suddenly I noticed that this dog somehow jumped over the fence and ran towards me. Almost crying, I ran to the nearest tree and with difficulty climbed up it. The terrible dog ran up and started jumping around the tree trying to reach me. In horror, I grabbed a branch trying not to fall, otherwise my end would come. Looking around and searching for salvation, I discovered an unexpected guest. The same red cat commander was sitting on a branch not far from me. He lazily looked at me in the eyes and then turned to the dog. The dog also noticed the cat, and when their eyes met, something unexpected happened. The dog, loudly growling and tucking its tail, retreated back. I opened my mouth in surprise again. It seems that this expression of my face has become normal for me, but then I thanked the cat and returned home. Thirdly, I noticed that at night he disappears somewhere and it happened closer to midnight. So, half a summer has passed. Everything was fine, but suddenly my grandmother became ill. A doctor visited us and prescribed bed rest for her. I was very worried about my grandmother, and the cats seemed to be too. They gathered at the foot of the bed, and when it was 11:30 p.m., they got up and marched out of the house in a column. I decided to follow them. Cats walked in a line one after another, crossed the garden, and coming to the back gate leading to the forest, nimbly jumped over it. I quietly opened the gate and followed them. When we entered the forest, the darkness suddenly descended as if we had passed through an invisible barrier. I was frightened, but seeing the outlines of the cats beginning to recede, I hastened to catch up with them. We walked for about 20 minutes, with frightening sounds and rustling occasionally heard. Something on the left was howling furiously, quietly but persistently. I was already ready to go back, but suddenly we came out to an open glade. I stopped and hid in the nearest bushes. Settling comfortably, I began to look at what was happening, and the scene I saw made me tremble. The cats were walking on their hind legs and dragging logs to the middle of the glade, and someone was digging pits. I later realized that they were drawing a circle and patterns on it. On the opposite side of the clearing, a large group of cats emerged from the bushes, carrying a huge cauldron filled with some liquid. They set it in the center of stones and added firewood underneath. Then someone started meowing, and the rest of the cats joined in, and a sort of cat chorus erupted. Suddenly, a fire ignited under the cauldron as if by magic. Then some cats stood on their hind legs and started dancing and spinning around the cauldron. I looked around and noticed that it had become even darker, and the howls from outside had increased. As I looked at the cauldron, I realized that it was beginning to boil, and the cats around were meowing louder and dancing faster, as if in a trance. A strong wind rose and the roar intensified. Covering my head, I continued to stare at the top of the cauldron, from which something resembling a hand slowly rose. The hand was slimy with long claws. The longer I looked, the more uneasy I became, or rather, I was in horror. Fearing to imagine what the owner of this terrible limb looked like, I wanted to leave, but my legs wouldn't listen, and I stared at the mystical procession. Suddenly, something scratched my leg from the side. I turned around in fear. It was the same ginger cat commander. He was scratching and spinning in place, attracting attention to himself. It seemed he wanted me to follow him, as he grabbed my dress with his teeth and pulled it to the side. This helped me come to my senses. I stood up and followed the cat quietly. But finally, I decided to take a look at the pot. Part of the head had already come out of it, and part of the eye was visible. Yes, the creature had only one eye, the pupil of which was constantly moving, examining what was happening around. I was in a daze, but I was again awoken by the cat, desperately signaling for me to hurry up. I hastened, and we seemingly emerged onto the same road we came from. A horrible howl echoed around us. I thought I saw someone's figures as well as glowing eyes. It was very frightening, but gathering myself, I forced myself not to look around and to follow the cat who was like a lighthouse to me. After some time, I passed through some barrier again, and silence enveloped us. The moonlight illuminated the surroundings. Exhaling, I fell onto the grass, trembling. I lay there and remembered the past with horror while the cat sat next to me and licked its paw. I reached out my hand and pet the cat and thanked it. Then I went home and went to sleep. This morning, my grandmother woke me up. She was perfectly healthy. I asked her in surprise what had happened, and she replied that in the morning she suddenly felt better. I wondered if it was related to yesterday's incident, and I told my grandmother what had happened, but she just laughed and said it was all just a dream. At that time, the cats came into the room and settled around. The same cat jumped onto my bed and looked at me, then looked at my grandmother. Suddenly, I saw something frightening in his gaze. Yes, I understood that it was a wild and hungry look. Suddenly, I began to connect the dots. What if it's not time yet? What if my grandmother should still be healthy? What if that creature hasn't gotten hungry yet? I was suddenly filled with enlightenment and a feeling of terror, and I screamed piercingly. It's been 2 years, but I still remember that day with horror. I think about it a lot, and I really want you to hear my story. It happened at my school. It was the middle of the school year, and it was already getting cold. It had been raining all week, and the weather was terrible. I didn't want to go to school, but I didn't want to stay at home either. It was all because of my mom. She became an alcoholic after my dad left us. She would swear a lot and often hit me. You know, the atmosphere at home was unbearable, so I became withdrawn and started avoiding socializing. Out of all my friends, only Michael remained. He also came from a troubled family. His father, a cruel and mean person, often beat him. That's why we became close, and he was good at studying and often helped me with my studies. I knew that Michael was being bullied by his classmates, but I couldn't do anything to help. I told the teachers, but they didn't pay attention to it. It was terrible, but Michael never complained. It seemed to me that he tried not to think about it. I felt sorry for him, and he probably felt sorry for me. As I've already mentioned, I didn't want to go to school that day, but my mom threw a fit, and I ended up going. In class, it was as noisy as usual, so I sat at the back and waited for the lesson to start. At that moment, I heard a loud bang, then another one, and several more times. The noise was coming from the hallway. My classmates began to get up and listen. I also wanted to understand what was happening. In about a second, I saw a bright red light in the window opposite us. I saw the glass shatter and there was a strong explosion. I was thrown back and fell to the floor. My ears were ringing, and I didn't understand what was going on. It was very difficult to breathe because of the dust, and I coughed a lot while trying to stand up. At that moment, the teacher walked into the classroom. He started shouting loudly, and I didn't understand what he was saying. My head was a mess. But I saw my classmates starting to barricade the door. Then I heard him say that there were terrorists in the school with automatic rifles, and we needed to wait for the police. At that moment, panic took over me, and I wanted to cry. I also began to feel a burning sensation on my hands and face, and I saw cuts on myself. My clothes were covered in blood, and I was in a lot of pain. The teacher tried to calm us down by saying that the police were already on their way, but I could tell that he was very scared. His voice was not the same as usual, and he was breathing very heavily. At some point, the school loudspeaker turned on, but instead of the usual voice of the dean, we heard laughter that lasted for several seconds. Then the person started squealing like a pig and laughing. Suddenly, he began to scream that everyone would die, that the dean was dead, the security guards were dead, that we were pigs and he had come for our scalps. I closed my eyes and ears. It was hard to listen to such things, and I started feeling nauseous. I saw some of my classmates crying. Then the maniac said that he was going hunting, and the broadcast stopped. For a few minutes, we just lay there quietly. Sometimes we heard gunshots and screams, or someone running down the hallway and asking for help. It felt like a lot of time had passed when we heard sirens outside through the broken windows. Finally, the police arrived. I stood up to look and saw students jumping out of the second-floor window. They fell, got up, and ran to the exit. We were on the 4th floor, so nobody dared to jump. Suddenly, I saw him. He was standing on the 3rd floor opposite our windows. He was wearing a rabbit mask and an army jacket. He pulled out a gun and started shooting at the students. I saw someone fall. My classmates started screaming in panic. The psychopath in the rabbit mask looked at us, and I got scared and quickly lay down on the floor. A few minutes later, we heard footsteps in the corridor. The footsteps were getting closer to us. The teacher, in fear, grabbed a chair. Then someone started pulling the door handle, trying to open our door. When he couldn't do it, he started shouting loudly that he was from the police and that the wing of the school was under their control and we could come out of the classroom. The teacher was happy and quickly removed the barricades. I slowly stood up, feeling a little dizzy and weak in the legs. I couldn't believe that this hell had finally ended. When the teacher opened the door, we heard a loud bang. Suddenly, the teacher was forcefully thrown back. He flew like a doll and fell on the chairs. I was shocked and didn't understand at first, but when the psychopath in the horse mask entered the classroom, everything became clear. There were 2 of them, and the second one pretended to be a police officer. He took out a gun and began counting from 3 to 1, and then he fired. I couldn't move from my spot. Fear completely paralyzed me. He continued to count and shoot. I heard screams, moans. Someone tried to jump out the window. Someone called for their mom. I kept standing there, and in that moment it seemed to me that I had even forgotten how to breathe. I kept thinking, why are they doing this? It didn't last long. Suddenly, another psycho in a rabbit mask entered the classroom, which distracted the crazy person in the horse mask. They looked at each other. Suddenly, the one who was the horse started dancing in front of the rabbit. He did a moonwalk and aimed his gun at me. He started counting down from 3 to 1. And when this maniac was about to shoot me, the psycho in the rabbit mask suddenly aimed his gun and shot the crazy person in the horse mask. He killed him and then turned to me and looked at me for a long time. I was waiting in fear for him to shoot me, but the crazy person in the rabbit mask just took off and left. I stood in the classroom for a long time until the police arrived and escorted us to a safe zone. In the ambulance, I lost consciousness. I woke up in the hospital room after a few days. Stitches had already been applied to me, and I was promised to be discharged as soon as I got better. A few days later, the police reported the results of the investigation. It turned out that there were only 2 attackers, and they were students of this school. Their identities were not disclosed, but journalists were able to dig up their names. The one who saved me, the psycho in the rabbit mask, turned out to be my only friend, Michael. The police could not arrest him, and he shot himself in the principal's office. I felt sad when I learned about it.
It was a dark, humid evening, the kind that crawled under your skin and made your hair stand on end. The old oak trees swayed with the breeze, their limbs creaking as if whispering secrets to one another. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows upon the cracked pavement. That's when I knew we had reached the threshold of our high school horror. My name is Alex, and my friends and I had decided to partake in a chilling challenge. The aim was simple: spend the night at the long-abandoned and supposedly haunted Riverwood High School. As a senior in high school, I had always been drawn to the macabre and the inexplicable, seeking to capture the essence of the supernatural on camera. My friends shared a similar fascination, and we couldn't resist exploring the harrowing depths of the school that had been consumed by darkness. As we approached the entrance, the air grew colder, and a sinister atmosphere enveloped us. "Guys, are we really doing this?" my friend Sam asked, his voice quivering with trepidation. My best friend Lily chimed in, her emerald eyes gleaming with curiosity. "We've come this far, Sam. There's no turning back now." We formed a small circle, our bodies shivering from the chill in the air and the adrenaline coursing through our veins. My other friend, Mark, a hulking figure with a penchant for football and fearlessness, cracked his knuckles and said, "Let's do this. We'll stick together, no matter what." With a sense of unity and determination, we entered the forsaken school, our flashlights cutting through the darkness like ethereal knives. The building reeked of decay, an unsettling mixture of mold, damp wood, and the distant whiff of rusted iron. The walls, once a vibrant green, were now covered in graffiti and grime, a testament to the fleeting nature of youth and innocence. As we ventured further into the abyss, we couldn't help but feel the weight of the past pressing down on us, suffocating our very souls. We entered a room that once served as the school's library, its once magnificent shelves now barren and desolate. "This place gives me the creeps," Sam muttered, his voice echoing through the desolation. Lily, ever the brave one, whispered softly, "The stories of the missing children must have started here. I can't help but feel their presence, lingering in the shadows." The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, a premonition of the horrors that awaited us. Mark, his eyes wide with intrigue, stumbled upon a dusty, ancient tome buried beneath the rubble. "Hey, check this out," he called out, his voice barely audible amidst the deafening silence. We gathered around him, our breaths held in anticipation, as he opened the book to reveal a list of names, some crossed out, others circled in red. "What is it?" Lily inquired, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a record of the students who attended this school," Mark replied, his voice heavy with the burden of the knowledge he held. "And I think some of these names are the ones who went missing." As we pored over the names, our hearts pounded in unison, the gravity of our situation dawning on us. The terror we sought to capture now held us captive, its icy tendrils coiling around our souls. The grim discovery of the old record book had shaken us to our cores, and yet we couldn't tear ourselves away from the allure of Riverwood High's enigmatic past. Our quest for answers only intensified, and we pressed onward, traversing the dimly lit hallways that seemed to stretch into oblivion. Our footsteps echoed through the building, and with each step, the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, more sinister. We found ourselves in what must have been the art room, the walls adorned with half-finished paintings, their subjects contorted and grotesque, as if writhing in pain. "This place is like a nightmare," Sam murmured, his eyes darting from one horrifying piece to another. I turned to Lily, who stood transfixed by a portrait of a young girl, her eyes hollow and devoid of life. "What do you make of this, Lil?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "It's like the soul of the artist was trapped here, forever bound to this place," she replied, her voice strained with a mix of awe and fear. "This is more than just a school. It's a prison for the lost." As we continued our exploration, the sense of being watched grew stronger, as if we were being followed by unseen eyes. The air grew colder, our breaths misting in the icy atmosphere. We stumbled upon a classroom, its desk still arranged in neat rows, a chalkboard looming ominously at the front. Mark, ever the skeptic, scoffed at our mounting unease. "Come on, guys, it's just an old building. There's nothing here but cobwebs and rats." His bravado, however, seemed to falter as he stepped toward the blackboard, the eerie silence swallowing his words. As Mark reached out to touch the chalkboard, the room came alive with an otherworldly energy. The chalk flew from its resting place, scrawling words and symbols across the surface, as if controlled by an invisible hand. "What the hell is going on?" Sam cried out, his voice cracking with terror. Lily, her eyes wide with amazement, whispered, "It's like the spirits are trying to communicate with us. They want us to know their story." We stood in awe as the message took shape before our very eyes, revealing the chilling words, "They are still here. Save us." Our hearts raced, the hairs on the back of our necks standing on end. I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of responsibility, a duty to uncover the truth behind the haunted walls of Riverwood High. As we ventured deeper into the building, we discovered a hidden staircase, its existence concealed behind a rotting bookshelf. The air grew colder, our breaths condensing as we descended into the darkness, our flashlights casting eerie shadows upon the damp walls. We found ourselves in the school's basement, a labyrinth of rusted pipes and crumbling brick. The air was thick with the stench of decay and fear, and we couldn't shake the feeling that something evil lurked within these walls. We came upon a small room, its door hanging ajar, a foul odor emanating from within. As we entered, our flashlights revealed a horrifying sight. Children's clothing and sneakers, long forgotten and decaying, strewn across the floor. The walls were adorned with unsettling drawings depicting gruesome rituals and grotesque creatures. Sam, his face pale with terror, choked out, This is where they disappeared. The missing children." Lily, her voice trembling, added, "And the things they must have seen, the horrors they must have endured." Mark, his bravado all but vanished, stammered, "We need to get out of here, now." I knew he was right, but a part of me still yearned for answers. "No," I protested. "We need to find out what happened here. We need to help those lost souls." Lily, her eyes brimming with determination, agreed. "Alex is right. If we leave now, their suffering will have been for nothing. We have to see this through." As we continued our search, we stumbled upon a tattered journal, its pages stained and frayed. The entries were written in an erratic scrawl, the ink smudged and faded, but we could make out a chilling revelation. Our names were written among the list of potential victims. "What does this mean?" Sam asked, his voice shaking. "It means we're not alone in this place," Mark replied, his eyes darting around the room. "Someone, or something, knows we're here." The realization hit us like a ton of bricks, our hearts pounding in unison. We were no longer just observers of Riverwood High's sinister past. We were now part of its twisted narrative. As the night grew darker, the inexplicable phenomena intensified. We heard footsteps, the sound of metal grinding, as if something heavy was being moved. The air grew colder, a sense of malevolence pervading the atmosphere. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred, our senses betraying us as we encountered the unexplained. The lost souls of Riverwood High whispered their secrets, and we found ourselves drawn deeper into the darkness. Suddenly we caught a glimpse of a tall figure cloaked in black, his face obscured by a hood. We froze, our breaths caught in our throats, as the menacing figure approached. "Run!" Mark cried out, his voice cracking with fear. We scrambled to our feet, our hearts pounding as we fled through the labyrinth of the school, the figure in black hot on our heels. Every turn brought a new terror, the very walls of Riverwood High closing in on us. We knew we couldn't escape our fate, but we refused to go down without a fight. The spirits of the lost children urged us on, their whispers guiding us through the darkness, and we vowed to uncover the truth behind Riverwood High's haunting past. As the night drew to a close, we prepared ourselves for the final confrontation, our lives and the souls of the missing children hanging in the balance. Our journey into the heart of darkness was far from over, and we knew that the horrors that awaited us in the shadows of Riverwood High would forever haunt our dreams. Our hearts raced as we navigated the labyrinth of Riverwood High's haunted hallways, the sinister figure in black pursuing us relentlessly. We had no choice but to face the darkness head-on, to confront the evil that had consumed the school and the souls of the missing children. As we fled, Lily, ever the intuitive one, noticed a pattern in the drawings on the walls. "Guys, look," she cried out, her voice breathless. "These symbols are some sort of protective charm. Maybe we can use them to our advantage." We halted in our tracks, our flashlights illuminating the ancient symbols etched upon the walls. Mark, his skepticism momentarily subdued, agreed. "It's worth a shot. We need every advantage we can get." With renewed determination, we retraced our steps, following the trail of symbols, each one leading us further into the bowels of the school. The air grew colder, the darkness closing in around us like a suffocating embrace. We found ourselves in the heart of Riverwood High, a room that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The walls were adorned with more of the mysterious symbols, their power stronger here than anywhere else in the building. As we entered, we could feel the spirits of the missing children, their suffering and torment palpable in the air. "They're still here," Lily whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We have to help them." We huddled together, forming a protective circle, our flashlights casting eerie shadows upon the walls. Sam, his fear momentarily forgotten, began to chant, his voice resonating with the power of the ancient symbols. Our voices joined his, forming a chorus of hope and defiance, our words echoing through the darkness. The room began to tremble, the very foundation of Riverwood High quaking beneath our feet. The figure in black appeared, his malevolence palpable in the air. He moved with unnatural speed, his eyes burning with hatred. We stood our ground, our voices rising in a crescendo of power, the symbols upon the walls glowing with a brilliant light. The figure lunged at us, his cloak billowing like a dark cloud. Mark, his courage rekindled, charged at the figure, grappling with him in a desperate struggle. "Get out of here," he roared, his voice filled with the strength of 1,000 warriors. We hesitated, torn between the desire to help our friend and the knowledge that we had to finish what we had started. "We have to go," Lily urged, her eyes brimming with tears. "Mark's sacrifice can't be in vain." With heavy hearts, we continued our mission, our voices rising in a chorus of hope and defiance, the spirits of the missing children guiding our path. As we chanted, the walls of Riverwood High began to crumble, the darkness receding, the malevolent presence weakening. We could feel the spirits of the children, their essence breaking free from the prison of Riverwood High, their souls finally at peace. We pressed on, our voices growing stronger, the power of the symbols propelling us forward. The figure in black, his power diminished, cornered us in a room with boarded-up windows. His hood fell back, revealing a face twisted with rage and despair. "You can't escape," he snarled, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. "This place will consume you, just as it consumed them." Mark, his body battered and bruised, appeared at the doorway, his eyes blazing with determination. "Not today," he growled, lunging at the figure, tackling him to the ground. As they wrestled, we seized the opportunity, joining our voices once more, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter, the power of our unity surging through the room. The air crackled with energy, the very fabric of reality bending to our will. The figure in black howled in rage, his body convulsing as the power of the symbols began to consume him. Mark, his strength waning, yelled, "Now's our chance! Get out of here!" We rushed to the boarded-up windows, our combined strength tearing the planks free, the night air rushing in like a balm to our weary souls. One by one, we climbed through the window, the figure in black's screams echoing behind us. As we dropped to the ground, we could see the school engulfed in a brilliant light, the power of the symbols finally banishing the darkness that had plagued Riverwood High for so long. The spirits of the missing children, now free from their torment, ascended into the night sky, their essence returning to the world of the living. Exhausted but triumphant, we huddled together, our bond forged in the fires of fear and adversity. We had confronted the darkness, faced the unspeakable horrors of Riverwood High, and emerged victorious. As we limped away from the school, the first rays of dawn breaking on the horizon, we knew that our lives would never be the same. The memories of that night would haunt us forever, a chilling reminder of the fragile line between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. We called the police, our voices shaking as we recounted our harrowing ordeal. They searched the school, their flashlights piercing the darkness, but found no trace of the figure in black. Riverwood High, once a bastion of fear and suffering, now stood silent, its halls echoing with the whispers of the spirits we had set free. As we stood on the precipice of our new reality, our hearts heavy with the knowledge of the horrors we had witnessed, we knew that we were forever changed. We had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, united in our purpose to protect the innocent and expose the secrets that lurked in the shadows. For we were the guardians of the night, the warriors of the light, the defenders of the lost and forgotten. And together we would stand against the darkness, a beacon of hope in a world consumed by fear.